Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. The storm had passed through Plaquemines Parish just after midnight, the kind that turned back roads into creeks and left everything smelling like diesel and dead fish. By the time Sheriff Lucien Thibodeau pulled his cruiser onto the levee road that morning, the water had mostly drained back into the basin, but the damage was everywhere. Sugarcane fields sat flooded knee-deep in places, the stalks bent and twisted like broken fingers. Spanish moss hung heavy and dripping from the cypress trees along the roadside, and the air had that thick, wet quality that made your lungs work harder just to breathe. Lucien had been sheriff for 11 years, long enough to know that storms like this always brought trouble. Sometimes it was looters hitting the empty houses along the river. Sometimes it was idiots trying to drive through water that looked shallow until their engine flooded out. And sometimes, like today, it was people who went out on the water and didn't come back. He parked near the boat launch at Cocodrie Point, where a small crowd had already gathered. A woman in a yellow rain jacket stood near the water's edge, arms wrapped around herself despite the humidity. Two men and waiters were talking quietly by a pickup truck, and Deputy Auguste Bro was crouched near the dock, writing something in his notebook. Auguste looked up when Lucien approached, his face drawn and tired. The kid, well, he wasn't really a kid anymore, had to be pushing 30 by now, had been on the force for 6 years, and he was good at his job. Kept his head down, didn't ask stupid questions, and knew when to keep his mouth shut. Lucien respected that. "Morning, Sheriff," Auguste said, standing and tucking the notebook into his belt. "Got a missing person report, came in about an hour ago. Fishing boat, single occupant. Name's Gerald Arsenault. Wife says he went out yesterday evening right before the storm hit. She expected him back by midnight at the latest." Lucien glanced toward the water. The basin stretched out before them, dark and still, broken only by the occasional stump or cluster of cypress knees poking through the surface. The sky was overcast, the clouds low and threatening more rain, and the whole scene had that oppressive, waiting quality that made Lucien's jaw tighten. "He go out alone?" Lucien asked. "Yes, sir. Wife says he does it all the time, checks his lines, traps, that kind of thing. She wasn't worried at first, said he's weathered worse, but when he didn't come back by dawn, she called it in." Lucien nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the shoreline. There were a dozen places a boat could get hung up out there, especially after a storm. Submerged logs, debris fields, tangles of vegetation thick enough to stop an outboard dead. And if Gerald had been drinking, which plenty of folks did when they went out on the water, then it was possible he'd just gotten himself stuck somewhere and was waiting for someone to find him. But something about the way Auguste was standing, the way his hand kept drifting back to his notebook like he wanted to say more, told Lucien there was another piece to this. "What else?" Lucien asked. Auguste glanced toward the woman in the yellow jacket, then back to Lucien. "Wife says she heard something on the radio last night, during the storm. Said it sounded like Gerald calling for help, but the signal was breaking up real bad. She couldn't make out what he was saying, just that he sounded..." Auguste paused, choosing his words carefully. "Scared." Lucien's expression didn't change, but his gut tightened. "She tried to call him back?" "Yeah, no answer. She tried his cell too, but it went straight to voicemail. Service out here's always spotty, especially in bad weather, so she figured maybe he'd just lost signal. But now..." Auguste trailed off, looking back towards the water. Lucienne was quiet for a moment, watching the way the surface rippled slightly in the breeze. The basin was deceptive, looked calm from a distance, but up close you could see the currents pulling through the channels, the way debris moved in slow, lazy circles near the shallows. It was easy to underestimate water like this, easy to think you knew what you were dealing with right up until it killed you. "All right," Lucienne said finally. "Let's get a search going. I want boats on the water within the hour. Start with the main channels, then work outward. Check every dock, every tie-up point, every place he might have pulled in to wait out the storm." Auguste nodded and started toward the truck, but Lucienne stopped him with a raised hand. "And, Auguste, keep this quiet for now. No need to get the whole parish stirred up until we know what we're dealing with." "Yes, sir." The crowd near the dock had grown slightly, a few more people drifting over from the parking area to see what was going on. Lucienne recognized most of them. Shrimpers, fishermen, folks who lived and worked on the water their whole lives. They stood in small clusters, talking in low voices, the kind of quiet speculation that always followed something like this. Lucienne walked over to the woman in the yellow jacket. Up close, he could see the exhaustion on her face, the red-rimmed eyes that told him she hadn't slept. Her hands were shaking slightly, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. "Mrs. Arsenault," Lucienne said gently. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mercy Landreneau. I kept my maiden name. I'm Sheriff Thibodeau. I understand your husband didn't come home last night." Mercy's eyes flicked toward the water, then back to Lucian. "He knows this basin better than anyone. He's been fishing these waters since he was a boy. He wouldn't just—" Her voice cracked, and she stopped, taking a shaky breath. "He wouldn't just disappear." Lucienne nodded slowly. "I'm sure he's fine, Mrs. Landreneau. Probably just got stuck somewhere and couldn't get back before dark. We'll have boats out looking within the hour." "I heard him on the radio," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Last night, during the storm, I heard him calling." "What did he say?" Mercy's hands tightened around the edges of her jacket. "I couldn't make it out. The static was too bad. But I know it was him. I know his voice." She looked up at Lucienne, her eyes searching his face for something. Reassurance, maybe, or just someone who would take her seriously. "He sounded scared. Gerald doesn't get scared." Lucienne held her gaze for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll find him." She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue. Just turned back toward the water, her arms wrapped tight around herself again, and Lucienne left her there, walking back toward where Auguste was coordinating with the other deputies who'd started to arrive. By 9 o'clock, they had 3 boats on the water. Lucienne and Auguste took one, heading north along the main channel that led deeper into the Atchafalaya Basin. The water was murky brown, churned up from the storm, and visibility below the surface was non-existent. They moved slowly, Auguste at the tiller, Lucienne standing near the bow with a pair of binoculars, scanning the banks and the water ahead. The basin was vast, thousands of acres of swamp and cypress forest, braided with channels and bayous that split and reconnected in ways that could confuse even experienced boaters. The storm had left debris everywhere, broken branches, torn sections of dock, a rusted oil drum half submerged near a cypress knee. They passed a heron standing motionless in the shallows, its neck curved like a question mark, watching them with one unblinking yellow eye. "Anything?" Auguste called from the back. "Nothing yet," Lucienne replied. They continued on, the engine a low rumble that echoed off the trees. After about 20 minutes, they reached a narrow cut-through that led toward a series of smaller channels Gerald was known to fish. Auguste slowed the boat. letting it drift slightly as Lucien swept the binoculars across the area. That's when he saw it. A boat, tied up near a cluster of cypress trees, maybe 50 yards off the main channel. It was a small aluminum fishing boat, the kind you could buy at any sporting goods store with a little outboard motor on the back. From a distance it looked intact. No obvious damage, no signs of capsizing. But it was empty. "There," Lucien said, pointing. Auguste followed his gaze, then steered them toward it. As they got closer, Lucien could see more details. The boat was tied to a cypress root with a length of frayed rope, the knot sloppy but secure. The outboard motor was tilted up out of the water, and there were a few items scattered in the bottom of the boat. A tackle box, a cooler, a coil of fishing line. No life jacket, no signs of a struggle. Auguste cut the engine and let their boat drift up alongside. Lucien grabbed the side of Gerald's boat to steady it, then leaned over to get a better look. The tackle box was open, lures and hooks spilling out across the aluminum floor. The cooler was closed, and when Lucien popped the lid, he found it empty except for a few inches of melted ice and a half-eaten sandwich wrapped in plastic. "Sheriff," Auguste said quietly. Lucien looked up. Auguste was pointing toward the bank where a narrow trail of disturbed mud led up into the cypress grove. It wasn't much, just a shallow depression in the soft earth like something had been dragged, but it was fresh. The rain would have washed away anything older. Lucien climbed out of their boat and onto the bank, his boots sinking slightly into the mud. Auguste followed, and together they walked up the trail, moving slowly, eyes scanning the ground. The cypress trees here were thick, their trunks wide and gnarled, roots spreading out in twisted masses that looked like frozen snakes. The Spanish moss hung so low in places that Lucien had to push it aside to keep moving forward. The trail led about 30 feet into the grove, then stopped. Just stopped. Like whoever, or whatever, had made it had simply vanished into thin air. Lucien crouched down, studying the end of the trail. The mud here was churned up, deeper impressions mixed in with the shallower drag marks. He reached out and touched one of the prints, feeling the cool, slick texture of the mud beneath his fingers. "What do you think?" Auguste asked, standing a few feet back. Lucien didn't answer right away. He was trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The prints were odd, too wide to be boot prints, and the shape was wrong. Almost like someone had pressed their hand into the mud. Fingers splayed, but larger. Much larger. He stood and scanned the area around them. The grove was quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavier than it should. No birds, no insects, just the faint sound of water lapping against the cypress knees and the distant hum of the other search boats somewhere deeper in the basin. "I don't know," Lucien said finally. They walked back to the boats, Lucien's mind turning over possibilities. Gerald could have gotten out of his boat for any number of reasons. Checking a trap, investigating something on the bank, even just taking a leak. But why would he tie up here in the middle of nowhere during a storm? And where the hell had he gone? Auguste started the engine, and they continued searching, moving deeper into the basin. They checked 2 more areas where Gerald was known to fish, but found nothing. No boats, no signs of disturbance, nothing that suggested anyone had been there recently. By early afternoon, the clouds had thickened again, and a light rain started to fall, turning the surface of the water into a field of tiny ripples. Lucien's radio crackled to life. "Sheriff, this is Deputy Romero. We found something." Lucien grabbed the handset. "What is it?" "Another boat, same setup as the first one. Tied up, empty, no sign of the owner. This one's about 2 miles south of your position, near the old pipeline access road." Lucien exchanged a glance with Auguste. "We're on our way." They found Deputy Romero, waiting near a small clearing where the pipeline road cut through the swamp. The boat was there, just as he'd described. A slightly larger vessel than Gerald's, but in the same condition. Empty, abandoned. The rope securing it to a tree was neat and deliberate, not the kind of hasty knot someone would tie in a panic. Lucien climbed onto the bank and walked toward the boat. Inside, he found a similar scene. Gear scattered across the floor, a cooler with a few cans of beer still cold, a fishing rod propped against the side. But no owner, no signs of violence, just another empty boat in the middle of the swamp. "Who does this one belong to?" Lucien asked. Romero checked his notes. Registration says it's owned by a man named Claude Dago. Lives over in Thibaudeau. Wife called in a missing person report this morning. Said he went out fishing yesterday afternoon and never came back. Lucien felt that tightness in his gut again. The one that told him this wasn't just a couple of guys who'd gotten lost or had engine trouble. This was something else. Something wrong. "Any other boats reported missing?" he asked. "Not yet," Romero said. "But I can check with dispatch. Do that. And I want a full search of this area, every channel, every cut-through, every place someone could tie up a boat. If there are more of these out here, I want them found." By the time they returned to the boat launch at Cocodrie Point, the sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the water. Mercy Landreneau was still there, standing near the dock, her yellow jacket now soaked through from the rain. She looked up when Lucien approached, her expression a mix of hope and dread. "Did you find him?" she asked. Lucien shook his head. "We found his boat. He wasn't in it." Mercy's face crumpled, and for a moment Lucien thought she might collapse. But she steadied herself, one hand gripping the railing of the dock, and took a shaky breath. "Where is he?" "We don't know yet, but we're going to keep looking." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked past him, toward the dark expanse of the basin. "I told him not to go out. I told him the storm was coming, but he never listens. He never—" Her voice broke, and she turned away, her shoulders shaking. Lucien stood there, feeling the weight of her grief pressing down on him like the humid air. He wanted to tell her that everything would be okay, that they'd find Gerald alive and well, that this was all just a misunderstanding. But he couldn't. Because deep down, in that place where instinct lived, he knew this was only the beginning. That night, back at the station, Lucien sat at his desk, staring at the map of the basin spread out in front of him. He'd marked the locations where they'd found the two boats, red pins stuck into the paper like drops of blood. They were miles apart, in areas with no obvious connection, but something about the pattern nagged at him. Auguste knocked on the doorframe and stepped inside, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He set one on Lucien's desk and took a sip from the other. Dispatch confirmed 2 more missing person reports came in this evening. Both fishermen. Both went out yesterday and didn't come back. Lucien looked up. 4? 4, Auguste confirmed. And nobody's seen or heard from any of them. Lucien leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. 4 men, all experienced boaters, all disappearing within the same 24-hour window. It didn't make sense. The basin was dangerous, sure, but not like this. Not all at once. "What do you think happened out there?" Auguste asked. Lucien didn't answer. He was thinking about the trail they'd found near Gerald's boat, the strange prints in the mud, the way the silence in the grove had felt wrong. He was thinking about Mercy's voice on the radio, scared and broken, and the way the water had looked that morning, dark and still, and waiting. "I don't know," he said, finally. "But we're going to find out." Outside, the rain picked up again. drumming against the roof of the station in a steady rhythm. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once, then fell silent, and far out in the basin, hidden beneath the black water and the tangled roots of the cypress trees, something waited. Lucien didn't sleep that night. He tried, lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan making slow circles above him, listening to the rain tap against the windows. But his mind wouldn't settle. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those prints in the mud. The way they'd just stopped, like whoever made them had been plucked straight up into the air. He thought about the 4 empty boats scattered across the basin, each one tied up neat and careful, gear still inside, owners nowhere to be found. By 4:30 in the morning, he gave up on sleep entirely. He made coffee in the dark kitchen of his small house on the edge of town, standing at the counter and drinking it black while the sky outside slowly shifted from black to deep blue. His phone was on the table, and he kept glancing at it, half expecting it to ring with news. Good or bad, he didn't know which he was hoping for anymore. At 5:15, it finally did ring, Auguste's name on the screen. "Yeah," Lucien answered. "Sheriff, we got another one." Lucien set his coffee down, his jaw tightening. "Another missing person?" "No, sir. Another boat. Empty, same as the others. Deputy Guidry found it about 20 minutes ago near the west access channel off Highway 70. Said it looks like it's been there since yesterday, maybe longer." Lucien was already moving, grabbing his keys from the hook by the door. "I'm on my way. Get Guidry to secure the area. Nobody touches anything until I get there." "Yes, sir." The drive took 30 minutes, heading west on the highway as dawn broke gray and overcast across the parish. The rain had stopped sometime before sunrise, but the roads were still slick, puddles reflecting the low clouds. Lucien passed fields of sugarcane bent and battered from the storm, irrigation ditches overflowing with muddy water. A few houses had blue tarps stretched across damaged roofs, and in one yard, an aluminum carport lay crumpled on its side like a crushed beer can. Deputy Guidry was waiting near the access road when Lucien arrived, standing beside his patrol truck with his arms crossed. He was an older guy, maybe mid-50s, with a thick gray mustache and the kind of weathered face that came from spending most of your life outdoors. He'd been with the department longer than Lucien had been sheriff, and he knew the basin better than most. "Morning, Sheriff," Guidry said as Lucien stepped out of his cruiser. "Show me." They walked down a narrow gravel path that led through a stand of willows to a small boat ramp. The water here was calmer than it had been out in the main channels yesterday, almost still, with just a faint current moving through. And there, tied to a concrete piling, was another aluminum fishing boat. Empty, abandoned. Lucien approached slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The boat looked almost identical to the others they'd found. Same size, same style, same scattered gear inside. A tackle box lay open near the bow, and a fishing rod was propped against the gunwale, line still attached and trailing into the water. There was a cooler, too, and when Lucien opened it, he found 3 cans of Abita beer, still cold. "Registration?" Lucien asked. Guidry pulled out his notebook. "Belongs to a man named Theriot. First name's Paul. Lives over in La Rose. His wife called it in last night. Said he went out fishing day before yesterday and she hasn't heard from him since." That made 5. 5 boats. 5 missing men, all in the span of 48 hours. Lucien straightened, looking out across the water. The surface was like dark glass, broken only by the occasional ripple where something moved beneath. In the distance, he could see the outline of cypress trees rising from the swamp, their branches hung with moss that swayed slightly in the morning breeze. It should have been peaceful, should have felt like any other morning on the water, but it didn't. "You check the banks?" Lucien asked. "Yes, sir." Found some tracks leading up into the brush, but they don't go far. Maybe 20, 30 feet, then they just stop. Lucien felt that familiar tightness in his chest. Show me. They followed a faint trail through the willows, pushing aside wet branches that slapped at their jackets. The ground here was soft, almost spongy, years of decayed leaves and mud compressed into a thick mat. And there, pressed into the softer patches, were the tracks. Drag marks mostly, long, shallow grooves like something heavy had been pulled through. But mixed in were those same strange prints Lucien had seen yesterday. Wide, splayed, too big to be human. He crouched down, studying one of the clearer impressions. The shape was odd, almost hand-like, but with longer fingers and a wider palm. The edges were blurred slightly, as if whatever made them had been wet or covered in something slick. He touched the edge of one print with his finger, feeling the cool mud compress slightly under the pressure. "What do you make of it?" Guidry asked, standing a few feet back. Lucien didn't answer right away. He was thinking about gators. They left tracks sometimes that could look strange, especially in soft mud. But gator prints had claws, distinct toe marks, a drag line from the tail. These didn't have any of that. And the spacing was wrong too. These looked almost deliberate, like something walking upright. "I don't know," Lucien said finally, standing. "But I want casts made of these, and photographs. Document everything." They walked back to the boats, and Lucien spent the next 20 minutes going through Paul Therio's gear. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place, nothing that suggested panic or a struggle. Just the ordinary possessions of a man who'd gone out fishing and planned to come back. But he hadn't come back. None of them had. By the time Lucien got back to the station, it was almost 8 o'clock. Auguste was at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, taking notes. He glanced up when Lucien walked in, gave a small nod, and kept talking. Lucien poured himself another coffee and stood by the window, looking out at the main street of the parish. A few cars passed by. A woman pushed a stroller down the sidewalk. Normal life, continuing on like nothing was wrong. Auguste hung up and turned in his chair. That was the Wildlife and Fisheries office. They're sending a biologist out this afternoon to look at those tracks. Also, state police called. They want to send a dive team out to search the channels where we found the boats. "Good," Lucien said. "Coordinate with them. I want divers in the water by tomorrow morning at the latest." Auguste hesitated, his pen tapping against the notepad. "Sheriff, people are starting to talk. Word's getting around about the missing boats. Folks are asking questions." "What kind of questions?" "The kind that don't have good answers. What happened to the men? Whether it's safe to go out on the water? Whether we think there's something—" Auguste paused, choosing his words carefully. "Something dangerous out there." Lucien turned from the window, his expression hard. "Tell them the truth. We don't know what happened, and until we do, anyone going out on the basin is taking a risk. If they want to fish, they do it in groups. They keep their radios on, and they stay in sight of shore." "Yes, sir." The day passed in a blur of phone calls and paperwork. More missing person reports filtered in. 2 more men who'd gone out on the water and hadn't returned. That made 7. 7 empty boats. 7 families waiting for answers Lucien didn't have. The wildlife biologist arrived just after lunch, a young woman named Dr. Broussard, who looked more suited to a classroom than a swamp. But she knew her stuff, and after spending an hour examining the casts Guidry had made of the tracks, she sat down in Lucien's office with a troubled expression. "I've never seen anything like this," she said, spreading the photographs across his desk. "The size is wrong for any native species. Black bears leave prints that can look hand-like, but these are too elongated, and the spacing suggests bipedal movement, which rules out most large mammals." "What about gators?" Lucien asked. Dr. Broussard shook her head. No, wrong shape entirely. Alligators have distinct claw marks and a completely different gait pattern. These tracks are... She paused, frowning at one of the photos. They're almost human, but not quite. Could they be faked? It's possible, but whoever made them would need to know a lot about anatomy and weight distribution, and they'd need to do it consistently across multiple sites. It seems unlikely. Lucien leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. So, what are you telling me? That there's something out in the basin we don't know about? I'm telling you I don't have an explanation, Dr. Broussard said quietly. And that concerns me. After she left, Lucien sat alone in his office, staring at the photographs. The tracks stared back at him, dark impressions in lighter mud, like wounds that wouldn't heal. He thought about calling in more help, state police, maybe even the FBI if this turned into something bigger. But what would he tell them? That men were disappearing from boats in the middle of a swamp, leaving behind strange footprints and no other evidence. They'd think he was crazy. The radio on his desk crackled to life. "Sheriff, this is Auguste. You need to come down to the dock. We've got a situation." Lucien grabbed the handset. What kind of situation? "It's Mercy Landreneau. She's trying to take a boat out into the basin, says she's going to look for her husband herself. I tried to stop her, but she's not listening." Lucien was already on his feet, grabbing his jacket from the back of the chair. "Don't let her leave. I'm on my way." He made it to the boat launch in under 10 minutes, pulling up fast enough that gravel sprayed from under his tires. Mercy was standing on the dock, one foot already in a small john boat, arguing with Auguste. Her face was flushed, eyes red-rimmed and wild, and she had a life jacket clutched in one hand like a weapon. "Mrs. Landreneau," Lucien called out, walking quickly toward them. "Step out of the boat." She turned on him, and for a moment he saw something break in her expression. Not anger, but desperation. "You're not doing anything. You're just sitting around making reports while my husband is out there somewhere, alone, maybe hurt, maybe—" Her voice cracked. "I can't just wait here, I can't." Lucien stopped a few feet from her, keeping his voice calm and steady. "I understand, but going out there alone right now isn't going to help Gerald. It's only going to put you in danger too." "I don't care," she said, but her voice wavered. "I have to do something. You have to trust me." Lucien interrupted gently. "We're doing everything we can. We have boats searching every channel. We have divers coming tomorrow. We have people working around the clock. But I need you to stay here. I need you to be safe. Because if something happens to you out there, Gerald's going to need you when we bring him home." Mercy stared at him for a long moment, her shoulders shaking. Then, slowly, she stepped out of the boat and onto the dock. The life jacket slipped from her hand and landed with a soft thud. Auguste moved forward to steady her, and she didn't resist, just let him guide her back toward the parking area where her car was waiting. Lucien watched them go, then looked out at the basin. The sun was starting to set, painting the water in shades of orange and red. It would have been beautiful if it hadn't felt so wrong. He stood there until the colors faded to gray, then turned and walked back to his cruiser. That night, back at the station, Lucien spread a detailed map of the Atchafalaya Basin across the conference table. Auguste stood beside him, along with deputies Guidry and Romero. Lucien had marked every location where they'd found an abandoned boat with a red pin, and now he studied the pattern, looking for something, anything, that made sense. "They're all within a 5-mile radius," Auguste said, tracing an invisible circle on the map with his finger. "But they're not grouped together. It's like they're scattered at random." "Nothing's random," Lucien muttered. He leaned closer, examining the waterways between the marked locations. most of them connected through a series of narrow channels that fed into a larger bayou on the eastern edge of the basin. It was an area thick with cypress groves and sawgrass, hard to navigate even in daylight. "What's this?" Lucien asked, pointing to a small notation on the map, a hand-drawn symbol that looked like a cross inside a circle. Guidry leaned in, squinting. "That's the old Mission Island site. Been abandoned for years. Used to be a logging camp back in the 40s. Then some kind of religious group bought the land and built a chapel out there. Place burned down in the 70s, far as I know. Nobody goes out there anymore, too overgrown, too hard to reach." Lucien stared at the symbol, something clicking in the back of his mind. "How far is it from where we found Gerald Arsenault's boat?" Guidry thought for a moment. "Maybe a mile and a half. A straight shot down the eastern channel. And from where we found Theriot's boat? About the same. All the sites are more or less equidistant from Mission Island." Lucien straightened, his jaw set. "We need to check it out." "Tonight?" Auguste asked, glancing at the window where darkness had fully settled. "First thing tomorrow morning. Full team. I want lights, cameras, the works. If there's something out there, I want to know what it is." The deputies nodded and began gathering their gear. Lucien stayed at the table, staring at the map. Mission Island. He'd heard stories about the place when he was younger. Local legends about strange lights in the swamp, about sounds that carried across the water at night. He'd always dismissed them as the kind of tall tales people told to scare tourists. But now, looking at the pattern of disappearances, he wasn't so sure. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is dispatch. We've got a call coming in. Sounds like someone in distress. Audio's breaking up pretty bad, but they're saying they're on the water, somewhere in the basin." Lucien grabbed the handset. "Can you get a location?" "Negative. Signal's too weak. But they mentioned the old pipeline access road. Said they can see it from where they are." That was the western edge of the basin, not far from where they'd found Paul Theriot's boat. Lucien looked at Auguste. "Let's go." They took 2 boats this time. Lucien and Auguste in one, Guidry and Romero in the other. They launched from the Highway 70 access point, their spotlights cutting through the darkness as they moved slowly down the channel. The water was black and still, reflecting their lights back at them like a mirror. The air smelled like decomposition and wet earth, and every sound seemed amplified. The low hum of the outboard motors, the splash of water against the hulls, the distant call of something in the trees. "Keep your eyes open," Lucien called out over the sound of the engines. They moved deeper into the basin, following the main channel toward the pipeline access road. The cypress trees here grew thick and close, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out what little moonlight filtered through the clouds. Lucien swept his spotlight across the banks, looking for any sign of movement, any indication that someone was out here. "There," Auguste said suddenly, pointing ahead. Lucien turned the spotlight. About 50 yards ahead, caught in the beam, was a boat. It was drifting slightly, caught in a slow eddy that pushed it in lazy circles. As they got closer, Lucien could see it was another aluminum fishing boat, identical to the others. The motor was tilted up, and the inside looked empty. They pulled alongside, and Lucien grabbed the gunwale to steady it. The boat rocked slightly with the motion, and something rolled across the floor, a flashlight still on, its beam cutting wild arcs across the water. Auguste tied the boats together while Lucien climbed aboard. The gear was here: tackle box, cooler, a rain jacket draped over the center bench. But no person, no blood, no signs of violence. Just another empty boat, adrift in the dark. "Sheriff," Guidry's voice crackled over the radio, "we've got something over here." Lucien looked up. Guidry's boat was about 30 feet away, near the bank, their spotlight aimed at something in the water. Lucien motioned for Auguste to steer them closer. As they approached, he could see what Guidry had found, a shape floating just beneath the surface, caught in the roots of a partially submerged cypress. "Hold the light steady," Lucien said. Guidry adjusted the spotlight, and in the harsh white glare, Lucien could make out details. It was a life jacket, the orange fabric bright against the dark water. But there was something else, something dark streaked across the front of it, like stains. Auguste used a boat hook to pull it closer, and Lucien grabbed it, lifting it out of the water. The life jacket was heavy, waterlogged, and as he turned it over in the light, he saw the stains more clearly. They were reddish-brown, dried but still visible. Blood. "Jesus," Auguste muttered. Lucien examined the jacket more closely. The fabric on one side was torn, long ragged cuts that looked almost like claw marks. He turned it over, checking the back, and found more damage. Punctures, neat and circular, like something had punched through from the outside in. "Bag it," Lucien said quietly, handing the life jacket to Auguste. "We need to get this back to the station, now." They secured the empty boat with a tow line and started back toward the launch site, moving slowly through the dark water. Lucien sat in the bow, his spotlight sweeping the banks, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every shadow looked like movement. Every sound made him turn, and somewhere out in the darkness beyond the reach of their lights, something moved through the water. When they finally reached the boat launch, it was past midnight. Lucien was exhausted, running on coffee and adrenaline, but he knew they couldn't stop. Not now. Not with 7 men missing and evidence that at least one of them might be dead. He sent Auguste home to get a few hours of sleep, told Guidry and Romero to do the same, and then sat alone in his office, staring at the blood-stained life jacket sealed in an evidence bag on his desk. His phone rang. Unknown number. "Sheriff Thibodeau," he answered. For a moment there was only static. Then, faintly, a voice, so distorted by interference that he could barely make it out. "Help? Water? Can't... Hello? Who is this?" Lucien said, sitting up straighter. More static, then, "Arsenault. It's in the water." The line went dead. Lucien stared at the phone, his heart pounding. Gerald Arsenault. That was Gerald's voice. He was sure of it. He tried calling the number back, but it went straight to a recorded message. "This number is no longer in service." He sat there in the dark office, the evidence bag in front of him, and realized that tomorrow's trip to Mission Island might be the most important search they'd ever conducted. Because if Gerald Arsenault was still alive out there, still trying to call for help, then they were running out of time. Outside, the rain started again, soft at first, then building to a steady drumbeat against the roof. And somewhere out in the Atchafalaya Basin, in the dark spaces between the cypress trees and the black water, something waited. Dawn came cold and gray over the basin. Lucien stood at the boat launch, watching his team prepare for the trip to Mission Island. They'd brought extra equipment this time: waterproof cameras, floodlights, flares, enough firepower to make him feel slightly less uneasy about what they might find. Auguste was checking the outboard motors on both boats, while Guidry loaded gear into waterproof cases. Deputy Romero stood off to the side, talking quietly into his radio, coordinating with the dive team that was supposed to arrive later that morning. Lucien sipped lukewarm coffee from a thermos and tried to ignore the knot in his stomach. He'd been a cop long enough to know when something felt wrong, and everything about this case felt wrong. 7 men vanished in less than 3 days. Strange tracks that no one could identify. A blood-stained life jacket torn by something with claws. And that phone call last night, Gerald Arsenault's voice, desperate and terrified, telling him something was in the water. "We're ready when you are, Sheriff," Auguste called out. Lucienne nodded and walked down to the boats. Dr. Broussard was there too, the wildlife biologist who'd examined the tracks yesterday. She'd insisted on coming along, said she wanted to see the site herself, and Lucienne hadn't argued. If there was something out there they didn't understand, having an expert might help. They loaded into 2 boats, Lucienne, Auguste, and Dr. Broussard in one, Guidry and Romero in the other. The engines rumbled to life, and they pushed off from the dock, heading east into the heart of the basin. The water was calm this morning, barely a ripple on the surface, and the sky hung low and heavy with clouds that promised more rain. They moved through familiar channels at first, passing the spots where they'd found some of the abandoned boats. Lucien kept his eyes on the banks, watching for any sign of movement. But the swamp was quiet. Too quiet. No birds calling, no fish jumping. Just the steady thrum of the outboard motors and the soft splash of water against the hulls. After about 40 minutes, they reached the eastern channel that led toward Mission Island. The waterway narrowed here, cypress trees pressing in close on both sides, their roots creating a maze of obstacles just below the surface. Auguste slowed the boat, navigating carefully, and behind them, Guidry did the same. "How much farther?" Dr. Broussard asked. She was sitting near the bow, one hand gripping the gunwale, her face pale but determined. "Maybe another mile," Auguste said. "Channel gets tighter up ahead. We'll have to watch for deadfalls." They continued on, the cypress canopy growing thicker overhead until they were moving through a tunnel of twisted branches and hanging moss. The light here was dim, filtered and green, and the temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Lucien felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He'd been on this water hundreds of times, but he'd never felt anything like this, a pressure in the air, heavy and expectant, like the swamp itself was holding its breath. "There," Guidry's voice crackled over the radio. "Up ahead on the left." Lucien looked where he was pointing and saw it. A break in the trees, a small clearing where the land rose slightly above the water line. Through the undergrowth he could make out the remnants of old structures. Rotted pilings, the collapsed frame of what might have been a dock, and farther back, half hidden by vines and brush, the blackened ruins of a building. Mission Island. They pulled the boats up onto a narrow strip of muddy shore and climbed out. The ground was soft beneath their boots, each step sinking slightly into the saturated earth. Lucien unholstered his flashlight even though it was daylight. The canopy here was so thick that it felt like dusk. "Stay close," he said, "and keep your radios on." They spread out in a loose line, moving slowly into the clearing. Dr. Broussard stayed near the center between Lucien and Auguste, her eyes scanning the ground. Guidry and Romero took the flanks, their hands resting on their sidearms. The ruins of the chapel, or what was left of it, stood about 50 yards from the shore. The walls had mostly collapsed, leaving only the stone foundation and a few charred support beams reaching up like skeletal fingers. Vines had grown through everything, thick ropes of vegetation that seemed to pulse with life. The air here smelled wrong, not just decay and rot, but something else underneath, something chemical and sharp that made Lucien's eyes water. "Watch your step," Auguste muttered, pointing down. Lucien looked. The ground here was uneven, pockmarked with depressions that filled with dark water, and in the mud around those depressions were tracks, dozens of them, the same wide, splayed prints they'd found near the abandoned boats, but here they were everywhere. Overlapping, crisscrossing, leading in and out of the ruins like a well-worn path. Dr. Broussard crouched down, examining one of the clearer prints. She pulled out a measuring tape and a camera, documenting everything with quick, efficient movements. "These are fresh," she said quietly, "made within the last day or two." "How many, you think?" Guidry asked. She looked around at the tracks covering the clearing. Hard to say. Could be one individual moving through repeatedly, or... She trailed off, her expression troubled. "Or what?" Lucienne pressed. "Or multiple individuals, a group." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and ominous. Lucienne moved toward the ruins, stepping carefully over fallen beams and piles of rubble. Inside what used to be the chapel, the roof had completely caved in, leaving only the open sky above and a floor littered with debris. But against the far wall, something caught his eye. A series of marks carved into the stone. He moved closer, brushing away vines to see them more clearly. They were symbols, crude but deliberate, cut deep into the rock. Circles and crosses and shapes that might have been letters in a language Lucienne didn't recognize. And beneath the symbols, smeared across the stone in something dark and flaking, were handprints. Human handprints. "Sheriff," Auguste called from outside. "You need to see this." Lucien made his way back out into the clearing. Auguste was standing near the edge of the ruins, pointing toward a section of ground that had been disturbed recently. The mud there was churned up, and when Lucien got closer, he saw why. Someone had been digging. The hole was maybe 3 feet across and 2 feet deep, filled partway with rainwater. And at the bottom, partially submerged, was something white. Lucien knelt down and reached into the water. His fingers closed around something smooth and hard, and when he pulled it up, his stomach dropped. It was a bone. Human, by the look of it. A femur, bleached white and scored with deep gouges along its length. "Jesus Christ," Romero muttered, taking a step back. Dr. Broussard moved forward, her face pale. "May I?" Lucienne handed her the bone. She examined it carefully, turning it over in her hands, running her fingers along the gouges. "These marks are recent, made by something with teeth, large teeth, set close together. And look here," she pointed to one end of the bone, where it had been cleanly severed. "This wasn't broken, it was cut, or bitten through." "Are we looking at animal predation?" Guidry asked. "I don't think so. The pattern's wrong. Most predators in this region, gators, bears, even large fish, they leave different marks. These are..." She paused, searching for the right word. "Methodical, almost surgical." Lucien stood, looking around the clearing with new eyes. The tracks, the symbols, the bone. This wasn't just a place where something bad had happened. This was a place where something bad was still happening. "We need to search the rest of the island," he said. "Carefully. Document everything you find, but don't touch anything unless you have to." They split up, moving through the undergrowth in pairs. Lucienne and Dr. Broussard headed toward the northern edge of the island, where the land sloped down toward a marshy area thick with cattails and sawgrass. The tracks were heavy here, concentrated, and as they pushed through the vegetation, Lucienne saw why. There was a structure. Not ruins this time, but something newer. A shelter built from branches and corrugated metal, half hidden beneath an overhang of cypress roots. It was crude but functional, maybe 8 feet across and tall enough to crouch in. And scattered around the entrance were items, clothes, a fishing rod, a tackle box, a waterproof bag with a name written on it in marker. Arsenault. Lucien's heart hammered in his chest. "Auguste," he said into his radio, keeping his voice low. "Get over here. North side of the island, near the marsh." While they waited, Lucien studied the shelter without getting too close. There were more bones scattered around the entrance. Smaller this time, looked like fish, and maybe small mammals. And there, half buried in the mud, was a cell phone. The screen was cracked, but when Lucien carefully picked it up, it powered on, showing 3% battery and no signal. The last call in the log was to the sheriff's office, yesterday at 11:47 p.m. Auguste and Guidry arrived, moving through half the brush quickly but quietly. When they saw the shelter, they both went still. "Is someone living out here?" Augusta asked. "Looks like it," Lucien said. "But I don't think they're living here by choice." He gestured toward the items scattered around. Most of them were things a fisherman would carry: gear, supplies, personal effects. But they were organized, arranged almost like offerings. And just inside the entrance of the shelter, barely visible in the shadows, was a pile of something that made Lucien's blood run cold. More bones. A lot more. Stacked carefully, almost reverently, in the back of the shelter. "We need to call this in," Guidry said, his voice tight. "Get forensics out here, crime scene techs, the whole works." Lucien nodded slowly, but he was thinking about that phone call. Gerald's voice, terrified and broken, saying something was in the water. If he'd made it to this island, if he'd survived long enough to build this shelter and try to call for help, then where was he now? A sound cut through the swamp, sharp and sudden, like a branch snapping. Everyone froze. Lucien turned toward the source, his hand moving to his sidearm. The sound came again, closer this time, followed by a wet, dragging noise. "Back to the boats," Lucien said quietly. "Now." They moved quickly but carefully, retracing their steps through the clearing. Romero was waiting near the ruins, his face pale, his radio already in his hand. "Sheriff, we got movement in the water. Something big, it's circling the boats." Lucien broke into a run, the others right behind him. They crashed through the undergrowth and back onto the narrow strip of shore, and what he saw made him stop dead. The boats were still there, tied to the cypress roots where they'd left them. But the water around them was disturbed, ripples spreading out in concentric circles, and just beneath the surface, moving with slow, deliberate grace, was a shape. It was hard to make out details through the murky water, but Lucien could see enough. Something large, maybe 8 or 9 feet long, with a body that tapered to what looked like a tail. But the front end, where the head should be, was wrong. Too large, too angular. As they watched, it surfaced. Just for a moment, just long enough for Lucien to see the slick, dark skin, the ridge of what might have been a spine, and the hint of something pale, teeth or bone, before it slipped back under. "Everyone in the boats," Lucien ordered. "Move!" They scrambled down the muddy bank, Guidry and Romero reaching their boat first and starting the engine. Auguste jumped into the other boat and began untying the rope while Dr. Broussard climbed in behind him. Lucien was last, 1 foot on the boat and 1 still on the shore, when the water erupted. The creature came up fast, launching itself partially onto the bank with a wet, slapping sound. In the harsh daylight, Lucien finally got a clear look at it, and his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. It was roughly humanoid in shape, 2 arms, 2 legs, a torso, but wrong in every detail. The skin was dark and slick like an eel's, covered in a film of something that glistened. The hands, if you could call them that, ended in long, webbed fingers tipped with curved claws. And the face was a nightmare. Flat and wide, with a mouth that stretched too far across, filled with rows of needle-like teeth. The eyes were large and bulbous, black and reflective, positioned on the sides of the head like a fish. And when it opened its mouth, a sound came out, part hiss, part shriek, that made every instinct in Lucien's body scream at him to run. He fired his weapon. The shot was loud in the confined space, echoing off the trees. The round hit the creature's center mass, and it jerked backward, that terrible mouth opening wider. But it didn't go down. didn't even slow down. It lunged forward again, claws reaching for the boat. Auguste had the engine roaring now, and Lucien threw himself fully into the boat as they pulled away from shore. The creature's claws raked across the aluminum hull, leaving deep gouges, but they were moving, water churning white behind them as they accelerated into the channel. Behind them, Guidry's boat was already ahead, racing through the narrow waterway. Lucien looked back just once and saw the creature sliding back into the water, disappearing beneath the surface with barely a ripple, and then, from the shore of Mission Island, more shapes emerged. 1, 2, 3. Maybe more, he couldn't tell. They moved with that same fluid grace, slipping into the water one after another, and Lucien knew with cold certainty that they were being followed. "Faster," he said to Auguste. "Go faster." The boats screamed through the channel, bouncing over small waves, branches whipping past on either side. Lucien kept his gun drawn, eyes locked on the water behind them, watching for any sign of pursuit. The creatures were fast. He could see them occasionally breaking the surface. Sleek shapes that moved through the water like missiles. But the boats had a head start, and Auguste was pushing the engine to its limit. They burst out of the eastern channel and into the wider basin, and Lucien finally allowed himself to breathe. The creatures didn't follow them into open water. He watched the mouth of the channel for a full minute, but nothing emerged. Whatever those things were, they preferred to stay in the narrow, overgrown waterways where they had cover. What the hell was that? Dr. Broussard's voice was shaky, her hands gripping the gunwale so hard her knuckles were white. Lucien didn't answer right away. He was thinking about the shelter they'd found, the bones stacked carefully inside, Gerald Arsenault's belongings scattered around like breadcrumbs. He was thinking about 7 missing men and the blood-stained life jacket they'd pulled from the water last night. "I don't know," he said, finally, "but I think we just found out what happened to those fishermen." They made it back to the boat launch without incident, though Lucien kept his weapon drawn the entire time. As soon as they were on solid ground, he got on the radio to the station, calling in everything: state police, wildlife enforcement, anyone who could help. This was bigger than a missing persons case now. This was something else entirely. By noon, the boat launch was packed with official vehicles, state police, game wardens, even a couple of FBI agents who'd been in Baton Rouge on another case and had driven down when they heard what was happening. Lucien spent the next 2 hours giving statements, walking people through what they'd seen, trying to make sense of something that defied explanation. Dr. Broussard sat in the back of an ambulance, wrapped in a shock blanket despite the humid heat, talking to another biologist who'd arrived from LSU. They were going through her photographs, examining the images of the tracks and the creature, their voices low and urgent. Auguste found Lucien near the parking area, where he'd retreated for a moment of quiet. "State police want to send in a tactical team tomorrow morning. They're talking about tranquilizers, nets, the whole works." "Good," Lucien said. "But I want our people there too. This is still our parish." "Yes, sir." Auguste hesitated. "Sheriff, what do you think those things are?" Lucien watched a pair of agents walk past, headed towards the dock. "I think there's something that's been living in this basin for a long time. Something people probably saw glimpses of over the years and dismissed as stories. And I think they've gotten bolder, or hungrier, or both." "You think the men are dead?" "I think some of them might be. But Gerald Arsenault was alive yesterday, alive enough to call for help, which means there might be others. And if there's even a chance, they're still out there. We have to go back." Auguste nodded slowly. "Tomorrow, then." "Tomorrow?" That night, Lucien sat in his office long after everyone else had gone home. The photos from Mission Island were spread across his desk. Images of the tracks, the shelter, the bones, and one grainy shot of the creature as it had emerged from the water. In that frozen moment, its mouth was open wide, showing those rows of terrible teeth, and its eyes caught the camera flash, glowing white like an animal's. He thought about calling Mercy Landreneau, telling her they might have found where Gerald had been. But what could he say? That her husband had been taken by something that shouldn't exist? That he'd survived long enough to build a shelter from scraps and try to call for help before something dragged him away? No. Better to wait until they knew for sure. Better to wait until they had something concrete to tell her. His phone rang. Unknown number again. Lucien's hand hesitated over the phone, then answered. Sheriff Thibodeau. Static, heavy and thick, like the line was underwater. Then, faint but unmistakable, help, please. They're coming back. Gerald? Gerald, is that you? Where are you? More static. A sound that might have been breathing. And then, just before the line went dead, Island, can't hold them off, please. Lucien stared at the phone, his heart pounding. Gerald was still alive, still on Mission Island, still waiting for rescue. And tomorrow, when they went back with the tactical team and the weapons and the nets, they were going to bring him home. They had to. Outside, the night pressed close and heavy against the windows. And somewhere out in the basin, in the dark water between the cypress trees, something ancient and hungry waited for morning to come. The tactical team arrived before dawn. Lucien watched them unload from 3 black SUVs, 8 men in body armor carrying weapons that looked more suited to a war zone than a Louisiana swamp. The team leader was a man named Fontaine, late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that said he'd seen his share of bad situations. He shook Lucien's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive. The handshake of someone who knew when to assert authority and when to defer. Sheriff Thibodeau, Fontaine said. Appreciate you waiting for us to get here. Wouldn't have it any other way, Lucien replied, though that wasn't entirely true. Part of him had wanted to go back last night. To hell with backup. To hell with protocol. But he knew that would have been suicide. Those things in the water were fast and coordinated, and going in alone would have just added his name to the list of missing. They gathered in the parking area near the boat launch, a loose circle of law enforcement and tactical personnel. Fontaine spread a map across the hood of his vehicle, and Lucien walked them through what they'd found yesterday, the location of Mission Island, the layout of the ruins, the shelter where they'd discovered Gerald's belongings, and the routes the creatures had used to pursue them back to open water. How many of these things are we talking about? One of the tactical officers asked. He was younger than the others, maybe mid-20s, and Lucien could see the skepticism in his eyes. Kid probably thought this was all overblown, that they'd find some guy holed up in the swamp and that would be the end of it. We saw at least 4, Lucien said. But there could be more. They move through the water fast, faster than our boats in the narrow channels, and they don't react to gunfire the way you'd expect. Fontaine looked up from the map. You shot one? Center mass. It barely slowed down. That got their attention. The skepticism faded from the young officer's face, replaced by something more cautious. Fontaine nodded slowly, then turned to his team. All right, we go in heavy. Kevlar vests, face shields, full kit. Non-lethal first, tranquilizer rifles, net guns. But if those don't work, we switch to live rounds. Aim for the head or spine. If these things are as tough as the sheriff says, body shots aren't going to cut it. They loaded into 4 boats this time. The 2 from yesterday, plus 2 more provided by the state police. Each boat had at least 1 tactical officer, and they'd brought enough firepower to start a small war. Lucien rode with Fontaine and Auguste in the lead boat, while the others fanned out in formation behind them. The sun was just starting to break over the horizon, painting the water in shades of gold and red, and in different circumstances it might have been beautiful. The trip to Mission Island took 45 minutes, moving slowly and carefully through the channels. Everyone was tense, weapons ready, eyes scanning the water for any sign of movement. But the basin was quiet. Too quiet. No birds, no fish jumping. Just the low rumble of the engines and the soft splash of water against the hulls. When they reached the eastern channel that led to the island, Fontaine raised his hand and the boats slowed to a crawl. "This is where they chased you yesterday?" "Yeah," Lucien said. "They came out of the water right after we found the shelter. Pursued us most of the way back to open water." Fontaine studied the narrow waterway, the cypress trees pressing close on both sides, the thick canopy overhead. "Good ambush terrain. They know this place better than we do." He keyed his radio. "All units, weapons hot, stay sharp." They proceeded into the channel, moving in single file now, each boat keeping close to the one in front. The light here was dim and green, and Lucien felt that same oppressive weight in the air he'd felt yesterday, like the swamp was watching them, waiting. They reached Mission Island without incident and pulled the boats up onto the muddy shore. The tactical team moved first, forming a perimeter while Lucien and the other deputies disembarked. Everything looked the same as yesterday. The ruins of the chapel, the tracks everywhere in the mud, the shelter near the marsh where they'd found Gerald's belongings. "Spread out," Fontaine ordered. "Teams of 2. No one goes anywhere alone. If you see anything, you call it in before you engage." They moved through the clearing in coordinated pairs, sweeping the area methodically. Lucien and Auguste headed toward the northern edge, back to the shelter. As they approached, Lucien noticed something that made his stomach tighten. The items that had been scattered around the entrance yesterday, the clothes, the tackle box, Gerald's bag, were gone. The shelter itself looked undisturbed, but everything that had been outside it had been moved or taken. "Sheriff," Auguste said quietly, pointing toward the ground. "Fresh tracks, leading away from the shelter and deeper into the marsh." They were the same wide, splayed prints they'd seen everywhere else, but these were different somehow, more deliberate, like whoever made them had been carrying something heavy. Lucien keyed his radio. "Fontaine, we've got fresh tracks heading northeast from the shelter. Looks like they moved Gerald's gear." "Copy that. Hold position. We're coming to you." They waited, weapons drawn, eyes scanning the thick vegetation around them. The marsh here was dense, cattails and sawgrass growing so thick you couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. The perfect place for an ambush. Lucien could hear his own heartbeat, loud in his ears, and the faint buzz of insects somewhere nearby. Fontaine and 2 of his men arrived, moving quickly but quietly through the brush. He examined the tracks, then looked up at Lucien. "You want to follow them?" "Gerald's still out here somewhere. Those phone calls were real. If there's a chance he's alive, we have to try." Fontaine nodded. "All right, but we do this slow and smart. 4-man team, you, me, Auguste, and Devereaux here." He gestured to one of the tactical officers, a stocky man with a tranquilizer rifle slung across his back. "Everyone else holds the perimeter." They moved into the marsh, following the tracks. The ground here was treacherous, soft mud that sucked at their boots with every step. The vegetation grew thicker the farther they went, until they were pushing through walls of sawgrass that cut at their hands and faces. And always, those tracks continued, a clear trail leading deeper into the swamp. After about 100 yards, the ground began to rise slightly. They emerged into another small clearing. this one dominated by a massive fallen cypress that had toppled sometime in the distant past. Its trunk was maybe 8 feet across, half submerged in standing water, covered in moss and vines. And there, huddled in the hollow space beneath the trunk, was a man. He was alive, barely. His clothes were torn and filthy, his face gaunt and covered in scratches, but Lucienne recognized him immediately from the photo Mercy had provided. Gerald Arsenault. He was conscious, his eyes wide and terrified, and when he saw them approaching, he tried to speak but only managed a hoarse croak. "Easy," Lucienne said, moving forward slowly. "Gerald, I'm Sheriff Thibodeau. We're here to help. Can you move?" Gerald shook his head weakly. They took the others. Dragged them into the water. I hid. I've been hiding for 3 days. Where are they now? Fontaine asked, scanning the area around them. Everywhere. They hunt in the day now. Used to be just at night, but... Gerald's voice trailed off, his eyes unfocused. He was in shock, probably dehydrated, maybe hypothermic despite the humidity. Auguste moved forward to help, pulling a thermal blanket from his pack. As he did, the water near the fallen cypress stirred. Just a ripple at first, barely noticeable, then another and another. "Contact," Devereaux said sharply, raising his tranquilizer rifle. The creatures came up fast, erupting from the water on all sides. 4 of them, maybe 5. Lucienne couldn't get an exact count because they were moving too quickly. They were just as horrifying in daylight as they'd been yesterday. Slick, dark skin, webbed claws, those terrible mouths full of teeth, and their eyes, black and reflective, locked onto the group with unmistakable intelligence. Devereaux fired first. The tranquilizer dart caught one of the creatures in the shoulder, and it staggered, hissing. But it didn't go down, just pulled the dart out with one clawed hand and kept coming. Fontaine opened fire with his sidearm, the shots loud and sharp in the confined space. One round caught a creature in the head, and it finally dropped, dark fluid spraying from the wound. "Headshots," Fontaine yelled. "Aim for the head." Lucien fired, his weapon bucking in his hand. The creature nearest to him jerked backward as the round punched through its skull, and it collapsed into the water with a heavy splash. But there were more. Always more. They were coming out of the water now, pulling themselves up onto the bank with those long, clawed hands, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for something so large. Auguste grabbed Gerald, hauling him to his feet. "Go! Back to the boats!" They ran, crashing through the marsh, the creatures right behind them. Lucienne could hear them, the wet slap of their feet on the mud, the hissing shriek they made when they got close. He fired over his shoulder without aiming, just trying to slow them down, and somewhere behind him he heard Devereaux scream. They burst back into the main clearing, where the rest of the tactical team was waiting. The officers opened fire immediately, a concentrated barrage that finally stopped the creature's advance. 2 more went down, their bodies jerking and twisting as the rounds found their marks. The others retreated, slipping back into the water and disappearing beneath the surface. "Move, move, move!" Fontaine was yelling, directing everyone toward the boats. They loaded Gerald into one of the boats, Auguste climbing in beside him to provide first aid. The tactical team formed a defensive line on the shore, weapons trained on the water, as the boats started their engines. Lucien was in the last boat, about to push off when he saw it. On the far side of the clearing, near the ruins of the chapel, something else was emerging from the undergrowth. It was bigger than the others. Much bigger, maybe 10 feet tall when it stood fully upright, its body thick and muscular, covered in that same slick dark skin, but with ridges along its spine that looked almost like armor. And its face, God, its face was worse than the others. More angular, more intelligent. When it looked at them, Lucien saw something in those black eyes that chilled him to his core. Recognition, understanding, and rage. The creature opened its mouth and made a sound that was nothing like the hissing shrieks of the others. This was deeper, resonant, almost like speech. And in response, the water all around the island began to churn. More of them, dozens of them, rising to the surface like a nightmare made flesh. "Go!" Lucien shouted, shoving the boat away from shore. "Go now!" The engines roared to life and they were moving, racing back through the channel as fast as they dared. Behind them, Lucien could see the creatures entering the water, could see that massive shape standing on the shore, watching them leave. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that they'd just made a terrible mistake. They'd found what they were looking for, but in doing so, they'd also awakened something that had been content to stay hidden in the deep places of the basin. They made it back to the boat launch without pursuit, though Lucien kept his weapon drawn the entire time, expecting at any moment to see those dark shapes break the surface. But the creatures didn't follow. Maybe they couldn't, or maybe they decided to let them go. Either way, when they finally reached shore and pulled Gerald out of the boat, Lucien felt a wave of relief so intense it made him dizzy. Gerald was immediately taken to an ambulance. Paramedics swarming around him, checking vitals and starting an IV. Mercy arrived 10 minutes later, her face streaked with tears, and Lucien stood back as she climbed into the ambulance with her husband. Through the open doors, he could hear Gerald talking, his voice weak but urgent, telling her things that made her face go pale. "We need to close the basin," Fontaine said, appearing at Lucien's side. "No boats, no fishing, nothing, until we can figure out what the hell those things are and how to deal with them." "That's going to be hard to enforce," Lucien said. "This is people's livelihood. The fishing industry alone. Then we make it official. Federal wildlife protection. Endangered species habitat. I don't care what we call it, but nobody else is going into that water until we're sure it's safe." Lucien wanted to argue, but he couldn't. Because Fontaine was right. Those things, whatever they were, had killed at least 6 men that they knew of. And that big one, the one that had watched them leave, it had looked at him with eyes that promised retribution. They'd invaded its territory. They'd killed some of its kind, and Lucien didn't think it was going to forget that. Over the next week, the basin was officially closed to all civilian traffic. Wildlife and Fisheries put up signs. The Coast Guard established a patrol perimeter, and anyone caught trying to enter the restricted area was subject to arrest. The story made national news. Mysterious attacks in Louisiana swamp lead to mass closure, and for a few days, the parish was swarmed with reporters and curiosity seekers. But interest faded quickly when no one could provide any real answers. The bodies of the creatures that had been killed were examined by biologists from 3 different universities, and their conclusions were all the same: unknown species, possibly a surviving population of something thought to be extinct, with adaptations that suggested centuries of evolution in isolated conditions. They were tagged as a protected species, and the basin closure was made permanent pending further study. Gerald Arsenault spent 2 weeks in the hospital recovering from dehydration, exposure, and trauma. When he was finally released, he and Mercy left the parish. Lucien heard they moved to Texas, somewhere far from any large body of water. He couldn't blame them. Of the other 6 missing men, only 2 bodies were ever recovered. They were found by the dive team, wedged into a submerged cave system near Mission Island. The condition of the remains suggested they'd been stored there deliberately, though for what purpose, no one wanted to speculate. The other 4 men were never found. Lucien stayed on as sheriff, but something had changed in him. He found himself driving out to the closed section of the basin sometimes, late at night, parking near one of the access points and just sitting there, looking out at the dark water, listening. Once, on a night when the moon was full and the air was still, he thought he heard something out there. That deep, resonant sound the big creature had made. A sound that was almost like words, but when he radioed it in, the patrol boats found nothing. A year later, on a humid evening in late spring, Louisiana was closing up the station when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick it up. "Sheriff Thibodeau," he said. Static, that familiar underwater sound, then faint but clear. "They're leaving the basin, moving south, following the waterways." The line went dead before he could respond. Lucien stared at his phone, his blood running cold. He knew that voice. It was Gerald Arsenault. But Gerald was in Texas, had been for months, and his old phone number had been disconnected. Lucien pulled up a map of the region on his computer, tracing the waterways that connected the Atchafalaya Basin to the Gulf of Mexico. Miles and miles of channels and bayous, spreading like veins through the coastal parishes. Hundreds of places those things could go if they decided to leave their isolated territory. He thought about that big creature, the one with the intelligent eyes, the one that had watched them leave with something that looked like calculation. And he wondered if maybe they hadn't been content to let the humans go after all. Maybe they'd just been waiting, learning, planning. Lucien picked up his desk phone and dialed. It rang 3 times before someone answered. "Fontaine," the voice said. "It's Sheriff Thibodeau down in Plaquemine. We need to talk." Outside, the night pressed close against the windows, and somewhere out in the basin, in the dark spaces between the cypress trees and the black water, something ancient and patient continued its slow migration toward the coast, toward the towns and cities where millions of people lived, unaware of what was coming. The Atchafalaya had kept its secrets for a long time, but nothing stays hidden forever. The flood came in August, which was unusual. Hurricane season typically peaked in September, but that year the Gulf had other plans. The storm, they called it Helene, though most people in Terrebonne Parish just called it the Big One, hit the coast with sustained winds of 120 miles per hour, and brought enough rain to turn the bayous into rivers, and the rivers into inland seas. By the time it passed, 3 days later, half the parish was underwater. Sheriff Beaufort Habert stood on the levee road just south of Houma, watching the water lap against the sandbag barrier they'd erected 2 days ago. The bags were holding, but barely. Another foot and the whole thing would breach, sending floodwater straight into the residential areas beyond. Behind him, a line of volunteers worked to stack more bags, their movements mechanical and exhausted. They'd been at it since dawn, and it was past noon now, the sun beating down with that particular cruelty that only comes after a storm. Beaufort, most people called him Beau, had since he was a kid, was 53 years old and had been sheriff for 14 years. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick around the middle, in the way that comes from too many late-night meals and not enough sleep. His face was weathered, lined deeply around the eyes and mouth, and his hands were rough from years of physical work. He'd grown up in this parish, knew every back road and bayou, every family and their history. This was his home, and watching it drown felt like watching a loved one slowly suffocate. His radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is dispatch. We've got another welfare check request. Address is 2847 Bayou Blue Road. Caller says her neighbor hasn't answered his door since before the storm." Beau pulled the radio from his belt. "Copy that. Who's the neighbor?" "Name's Boudreau. Emile Boudreau. 82 years old, lives alone. Caller says he usually comes out on his porch every morning. but she hasn't seen him in 3 days. Bo felt that familiar tightness in his chest. 3 days. That's how long the storm had been through. And in that time, they'd already pulled 4 bodies from flooded homes. Elderly folks mostly, people who either couldn't evacuate or had refused to leave. Each one felt like a personal failure. "I'm on my way," he said. "Tell her to stay inside until I get there." The drive to Bayou Blue Road took 20 minutes, navigating around downed trees and flooded sections where the water had jumped the banks. The neighborhood was older, houses built close to the bayou back when people trusted the water to stay where it belonged. Most of the yards were underwater now, brown floodwater lapping at front steps and porches. A few boats were tied to mailboxes, and Bo saw a dog swimming between houses, paddling toward higher ground. Number 2847 was a small raised cottage, painted white at some point but now faded to a dingy gray. The porch was just above the water line, and Bo could see that the front door was closed. No lights on inside, no movement. He parked his cruiser on a dry section of road and waded through knee-deep water to reach the front steps. "Mr. Boudreaux?" he called out, knocking on the door. "This is Sheriff Haber. I'm doing a welfare check. Can you hear me?" No answer. Bo tried the door and found it unlocked. He pushed it open slowly, the hinges creaking, and immediately smelled it. That sweet, heavy odor that every cop learns to recognize. Death. The inside of the house was dim, curtains drawn, and hot despite the floodwater outside. Bo pulled a flashlight from his belt and swept it across the room. The furniture was old but well-maintained, everything in its place. Photos on the walls showed a younger Emile Boudreaux, fishing, holding up a stringer of catfish, standing beside a woman who must have been his wife. On the mantel, a funeral card dated 5 years ago. Bo moved deeper into the house, following the smell. He found Emile in the bedroom, lying in bed like he'd just gone to sleep. But the gray color of his skin and the stillness of his chest told a different story. Bo approached slowly, checking for a pulse he knew he wouldn't find. The old man had been dead for at least 2 days, maybe longer. Natural causes, by the look of it. No signs of trauma, no indication of a struggle. Just an elderly man who'd died in his sleep while the storm raged outside. Bo stood there for a moment, looking down at Emile Boudreaux's peaceful face. Another one. Another person who'd died alone while the rest of the parish fought to survive. He keyed his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Haber. I need the coroner at 2847 Bayou Blue Road. We've got a deceased male, elderly, appears to be natural causes." "Copy that, Sheriff. Coroner's already on 3 other calls. Might be a few hours." Understood. Bo went back outside to wait, sitting on the porch steps and watching the floodwater flow past. This was the 5th body in 3 days. 5 people who'd died during or immediately after the storm. Heart attacks mostly, or complications from existing conditions. The stress of the hurricane, the fear, the physical strain of evacuating or sheltering in place. It added up, it killed people, but something about it felt off. 5 deaths in 3 days was unusual, even for a major storm. And they were all elderly, all living alone, all found in similar conditions. Peaceful, lying down, like they'd simply decided to go to sleep and never wake up. Bo told himself he was seeing patterns where there weren't any, that stress and exhaustion were making him paranoid. But the feeling persisted. The coroner arrived 90 minutes later in a white panel van marked with the parish seal. The driver was a young woman Bo didn't recognize. Probably a temp brought in to help with the increased workload. But the man who climbed out of the passenger side was familiar. Clem Doucet, owner of Doucet Funeral Home and the parish's primary undertaker for the last 30 years. Clem was thin to the point of gaunt, with pale skin that seemed to reject the Louisiana sun and dark eyes that sat deep in his skull. He moved with a deliberate slowness that some people found unsettling, but Bo had always attributed it to professional demeanor. You dealt with death every day. You learned to be careful and respectful. "Sheriff," Clem said, extending a hand. Bo shook it. The man's grip was cool and dry despite the humidity. "Thanks for coming out, Clem. Got another one inside. Emile Boudreau. Looks natural to me, but you'll want to confirm." "Of course." Clem gestured to the woman who grabbed a gurney from the back of the van. Together, they made their way into the house. Bo stayed outside, not wanting to watch the process. He'd seen enough death over the years that it didn't bother him the way it once had, but there was something about bodies being moved. The mechanical efficiency of it, the way a person became cargo, that still made him uncomfortable. 20 minutes later, they emerged with the gurney, a black body bag strapped to its surface. Clem directed the woman to load it into the van, then walked over to where Bo was standing. "Natural causes," Clem said quietly. "Heart failure, most likely. Very common in the elderly during high-stress events. That's 5 in 3 days, Bo said. Clem nodded slowly. "The storm took a toll. I've processed 12 deaths since it hit, half from flooding, half from medical complications. This is actually typical for a hurricane of this magnitude." Bo wanted to ask more, to voice the unease he'd been feeling, but he couldn't put it into words that didn't sound crazy. So he just nodded and watched as the van pulled away, Emile Boudreau's body heading to the funeral home where he'd be prepared for burial. That evening, Bo returned to the station to file his reports. The building was chaos, phones ringing constantly, deputies running in and out, volunteers organizing supply distribution. He made his way to his office and closed the door, grateful for a moment of quiet. But before he could sit down, there was a knock. "Come in." The door opened, and a woman stepped inside. Bo recognized her immediately. Eulalie St. Cyr, a nurse at the parish hospital. She was in her early 40s with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and the kind of tired eyes that came from too many double shifts. They'd worked together a few times over the years, coordinating medical responses to accidents and emergencies. "Sheriff," she said, "do you have a minute?" "Of course, please sit." Bo gestured to the chair across from his desk. Eulalie sat, her hands folded in her lap. She looked uncomfortable, like she wasn't sure she should be here. "I probably shouldn't be bothering you right now. I know you're busy with the storm response." "It's fine," Bo said. "What's on your mind?" She hesitated, then spoke. "Have you noticed an unusual number of deaths in the last few days? Elderly patients, mostly, all presenting with similar symptoms." Bo felt that tightness in his chest again. "I've responded to 5 welfare checks. All deceased, all elderly, all appearing to be natural causes. Why?" "We've had 7 more at the hospital," Eulalie said quietly. "All admitted during or immediately after the storm with cardiac symptoms. All died within hours of arrival, despite aggressive treatment. And there's something else. Their blood work came back with anomalies I've never seen before." "What kind of anomalies?" "Elevated levels of certain compounds. Sedatives, primarily. Trace amounts, but consistent across all 7 patients." She paused. "Sheriff, I think someone might be medicating these people without their knowledge." Bo leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. 12 deaths in 3 days, all elderly, all showing signs of sedation. "You're saying someone's poisoning them?" "I'm saying something isn't right. And with everything that's happened during the storm, the chaos, the displacement, the lack of proper oversight, it would be easy for something like this to go unnoticed." Bo thought about Emile Boudreau, lying peaceful in his bed, about the 4 others he'd found in similar conditions. Have you reported this to anyone else? I spoke to the hospital administrator. He said the findings were inconclusive and probably just stress-related anomalies. Told me not to cause panic during an already difficult time. Her jaw tightened. But I know what I saw in those blood tests. Those people were drugged. Bo pulled out a notepad and started writing. I need names, everyone who died at the hospital, everyone I found during welfare checks. Dates, times, locations, everything. Eulalie nodded and began reciting information from memory. Bo wrote quickly, filling 2 pages with details. When she finished, he looked at the list and felt his stomach drop. 12 names. 12 people who'd died in almost identical circumstances over the course of 3 days. I'll look into this, Bo said, quietly, until we know more. But Eulalie, if you're right, if someone is doing this deliberately, we're talking about multiple homicides. That's not something that happens by accident. I know, she said softly. That's what scares me. After Eulalie left, Bo sat alone in his office, staring at the list of names. He knew some of them, not well, but enough to put faces to the names. People he'd seen around town, at the grocery store, at church. Regular folks who'd lived their lives and deserved to die with dignity, not drugged and alone while a storm tore through their homes. He pulled up the parish database on his computer and started cross-referencing the names. What he found made his blood run cold. Every single person on the list had died within 24 hours of being visited by someone from Duce Funeral Home. Some had been contacted about prearranging their own funerals. Others had been visited to discuss services for deceased family members. But in every case, there was a connection to Clem Duce or his staff. Bo leaned back in his chair, his mind working through possibilities. It could be coincidence. Duce was the primary funeral home in the area, and it made sense that elderly residents would have had contact with them. But combined with Eulalie's findings about the sedatives, it painted a disturbing picture. His phone rang. He picked it up without checking the caller ID. Sheriff Hebert. Bo, it's Deputy Blanchard. We've got another situation. Elderly woman, address on Levee Road. Neighbor says she hasn't answered her phone since yesterday. Bo closed his eyes. I'm on my way. The drive to Levee Road took him past Duce Funeral Home. The building was set back from the road, a graceful old structure with white columns and manicured grounds that seemed untouched by the storm. As Bo drove past, he saw Clem standing on the front porch, talking to someone Bo couldn't quite make out in the fading light. Clem looked up as the cruiser passed, and for just a moment, their eyes met. Then Bo was past, continuing down the road, but the image of Clem's pale face watching him drive by stayed burned in his mind. The house on Levee Road was similar to the others, small, old, raised just enough to have escaped the worst of the flooding. The front door was locked this time, and Bo had to use a pry bar to force it open. Inside, he found the woman, Margaret Trosclair, according to the mail on her kitchen counter, lying on her couch, hands folded across her chest, eyes closed. Dead. Just like the others. Bo stood in the doorway, looking at the peaceful scene, and felt a wave of anger wash over him. This wasn't natural. This wasn't just the storm taking its toll on vulnerable people. This was something else, something deliberate and cruel. He called the coroner's office. When the dispatcher told him they'd send someone out, he asked specifically who would be responding. The answer made his jaw tighten. Clem Duce. No, Bo said. I need someone else, anyone else. Sheriff, Mr. Doucet is the only one available right now. Everyone else is on calls or dealing with the backlog from the storm. Bo wanted to argue, but he couldn't without explaining why, and he wasn't ready to do that yet. Not until he had more evidence. Fine. Tell him I'll be here waiting. He hung up and walked back outside, positioning himself on the porch where he could see the road in both directions. If Clem Doucet was involved in what Beau suspected, if he was somehow responsible for these deaths, then Beau wasn't going to let him out of his sight. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The floodwater had receded slightly, but it was still high enough to reflect the colors, turning the bayou into a mirror of fire. It would have been beautiful if Beau could have appreciated it. Instead, all he could think about was 12 elderly people, dead in their homes, their blood full of sedatives they'd never knowingly taken. Headlights appeared down the road. The white van with the parish seal. It pulled up in front of the house and Clem Doucet climbed out, moving with that same deliberate slowness. He walked up to the porch, a black bag in one hand, and nodded to Beau. "Sheriff, another one?" "Inside," Beau said curtly. "Margaret Trosclair appears to be natural causes, but I want a full examination before you move her." Something flickered in Clem's eyes, surprise maybe, or concern, but his expression remained neutral. "Of course. I'll need to check vitals and fill out the initial paperwork." Beau followed him inside, staying close, watching every movement. Clem approached the body with professional detachment, checking for a pulse, examining the skin tone, looking for signs of rigor mortis. He pulled out a clipboard and began making notes, his handwriting small and precise. "How long has she been deceased?" Clem asked without looking up. "I found her about 30 minutes ago. No way to know exactly when she died." Clem finished writing and tucked the clipboard under his arm. "I'll need to move her to the funeral home for a proper examination. The heat in here will accelerate decomposition." "No," Beau said. Clem looked up, his dark eyes unreadable. "I'm sorry?" "I said no. The body stays here until I can arrange for an independent autopsy." "Sheriff, that's highly irregular. The storm has already created a backlog at the coroner's office. Delaying the removal will only—" "The body stays," Beau repeated, his voice hard. "That's not a request." For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Clem slowly nodded. "As you wish. I'll note in my report that the body was left in situ pending further investigation." He turned and walked back to his van, movements still measured and calm, but Beau could see the tension in his shoulders. After the van pulled away, Beau called the hospital and asked for Eulalie. When she answered, he could hear the exhaustion in her voice. "I need you to come to an address on Levee Road," he said. "Bring whatever you need to take blood samples. I've got another body, and I want you to do the tests yourself before it goes to the funeral home." "Sheriff, I'm not trained in forensic." "I know, but you're the only person I trust right now. Can you do it?" There was a pause, then, "Give me the address. I'll be there in 20 minutes." Beau stood on the porch, watching the last light fade from the sky, and wondered what the hell they were dealing with. Somewhere out there in this flooded parish full of displaced and vulnerable people, someone was killing the elderly and making it look natural. And somehow, it was all connected to a funeral home that had served the community for 3 decades. In the distance, carried on the still evening air, came a sound that made Beau's skin prickle. A bell, deep and resonant, like a church bell being rung. But all the churches in the area had been evacuated, their buildings closed and locked. There shouldn't be anyone ringing bells. Beau pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Sheriff Haybert. Anyone else hearing a church bell?" "Negative, Sheriff. No reports of church services or gatherings." The sound came again, closer this time. Beau looked toward the source and saw, about a quarter-mile down the road, the silhouette of St. Michael's Church rising against the darkening sky. The building had been abandoned for years, too damaged from a previous hurricane to repair, but the bell tower still stood. and as Bo watched, the bell swung again, its toll echoing across the floodwater. There was no wind, no storm to move the bell, just that steady, deliberate ringing in the twilight. Bo climbed into his cruiser and started the engine. He had a feeling the night was about to get a lot longer. Bo drove slowly down Levee Road, his headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The sound of the bell followed him, each toll measured and deliberate, echoing across the flooded landscape. St. Michael's Church sat on a small rise about a quarter-mile ahead, its white steeple visible above the tree line. The building had been damaged in Hurricane Rita back in 2005. Part of the roof collapsed, water damage throughout, and the parish had decided it was too expensive to repair. It had sat empty ever since, slowly falling apart, a monument to storms past. But someone was inside now. Someone was ringing that bell. Bo pulled his cruiser up to the church's front gate, which hung open on rusted hinges. The parking lot was empty except for pools of standing water that reflected the darkening sky. He grabbed his flashlight from the seat beside him and stepped out into the humid evening air. The bell tolled again, the sound vibrating through his chest. "This is Sheriff Habert," he called out, his voice carrying across the empty lot. "Whoever's in there, you need to come out now. This building is condemned." No response. Just another toll of the bell. Bo approached the front entrance, testing each step before putting his full weight down. The wooden porch was soft in places, boards warped from years of water damage. The front door stood slightly ajar, darkness beyond. He pushed it open with his flashlight hand, keeping his other hand near his sidearm. Inside, the church was a ruin. Pews lay toppled and broken, covered in mildew and bird droppings. The floor was littered with debris, chunks of plaster from the ceiling, broken glass from the windows, leaves and branches blown in through gaps in the walls. Water stains climbed the walls like dark fingers, and the smell of rot hung thick in the air. The bell rang again, and Bo looked up. The rope that led to the bell tower hung down through a hole in the ceiling, swaying slightly. But there was no one pulling it. He watched as the rope moved again, seemingly on its own, and the bell tolled once more. Bo moved toward the rope, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. As he got closer, he saw why it was moving. The rope was caught on something, a piece of loose wood from the damaged ceiling, and the building's settling was causing it to shift and pull. Each time the structure creaked, the rope moved, and the bell rang. Not supernatural, just physics and decay. Bo felt a mix of relief and foolishness. He was letting Eulali's suspicions and his own exhaustion get to him, seeing mysteries where there were only broken buildings and bad timing. He grabbed the rope and secured it, tying it off to prevent any more movement. The church fell silent. As he turned to leave, his flashlight beam swept across something on the floor near the altar. Papers. He walked closer and saw they were scattered documents, official-looking forms with parish letterhead. Bo knelt down and picked one up, brushing away dirt and moisture. It was a death certificate, blank but authentic, with all the proper seals and signatures. And there were more, dozens of them, all blank, all official. Bo gathered them up, his mind racing. These forms were restricted, only available to licensed funeral directors and medical examiners. What were they doing in an abandoned church? He was about to radio for backup when his phone rang. Eulali's name on the screen. "I'm at the Levee Road address," she said without preamble. "I've taken blood samples from Margaret Trusclair. Sheriff, her hands, they have puncture marks, fresh ones, on both arms, like someone gave her injections recently." Bo stood up, the blank death certificates clutched in his hand. "Can you preserve the body? Keep it from being moved until we can get a proper autopsy?" "I've already called the hospital. They're sending a refrigerated unit. We're treating this as a suspicious death pending investigation." Good. I'm heading back there now. Don't let anyone from Ducey's funeral home near that house. Already done. Beau took one last look around the church, then hurried back to his cruiser. As he drove back toward Margaret Trosclair's house, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. The blank death certificates, the injection marks, the pattern of elderly deaths, all connected to the funeral home. It was starting to look less like natural causes and more like something deliberately orchestrated. When he arrived back at the house, Eulalie was waiting on the porch. She looked grim, a small cooler at her feet containing the blood samples. "I found something else," she said. "Come inside." Beau followed her into the living room where Margaret's body still lay on the couch. Eulalie pointed to the coffee table beside it. "Look at that." On the table was a business card. Ducey Funeral Home, with Clem's name and contact information. But it wasn't just a card. There was writing on the back in neat, precise handwriting. Pre-arrangement consultation scheduled for August 12th, 2:00 p.m. "That was yesterday," Eulalie said. "The day before she died." Beau felt his jaw tighten. He was here. Clem was in this house yesterday, meeting with her about funeral arrangements. And now she's dead, with injection marks on her arms and sedatives in her blood. Eulalie's voice was controlled, but Beau could hear the anger underneath. "This isn't a coincidence anymore, Sheriff." Beau pulled out his phone and called the station. When Deputy Blanchard answered, Beau spoke quickly. "I need you to pull records on every death in the parish over the last 6 months. Cross-reference them with anyone who had contact with Ducey Funeral Home in the week before they died. And I want surveillance on the funeral home starting now. Nobody goes in or out without us knowing about it." "Sheriff, that's a lot of just do it. This is priority 1. After he hung up, Beau turned to Eulalie. "I need you to run those blood tests as fast as possible. And I need to know exactly what drugs were used. If we're going to prove Clem Ducey is behind this, we need hard evidence." "I'll have preliminary results by morning," Eulalie said. "But Sheriff, if he's been doing this for a while, if this isn't just about the storm, then how many people has he killed?" It was the question Beau had been avoiding. He thought about all the funerals he'd attended over the years, all the elderly residents who'd died peacefully in their sleep, who'd been processed through Ducey Funeral Home without anyone questioning it. How many of those deaths had been natural, and how many had been something else? "I don't know," he said quietly. "But we're going to find out." The hospital's refrigerated unit arrived 20 minutes later, a small white truck with temperature controls and secure locks. They loaded Margaret Trosclair's body carefully, Eulalie supervising every step. As they were finishing, Beau noticed a car pulling up down the street. A dark sedan, expensive looking, with tinted windows. It idled there for a moment, engine running, then slowly drove away. "Did you see that?" Eulalie asked. "Yeah." Beau pulled out his radio. "All units, be advised. Dark sedan, possibly surveillance, heading south on Levee Road. Get me a plate number if you spot it." They waited until the refrigerated truck pulled away, Margaret's body safely secured, before Beau allowed himself to relax slightly. But the feeling of being watched persisted. Someone knew they were investigating. Someone was paying attention. Beau drove Eulalie back to the hospital, then returned to the station. It was past 9 o'clock now, and most of the staff had gone home, but Deputy Blanchard was still there, surrounded by files and computer printouts. He looked up when Beau entered, his expression troubled. "Sheriff, you need to see this." Beau walked over to Blanchard's desk, which was covered in papers. Death certificates, medical records, funeral home invoices. Blanchard pointed to a spreadsheet on his computer screen. "I went back 2 years instead of 6 months. Found 73 deaths in the parish where the deceased had contact with Ducey Funeral Home within a week of dying. It's not unusual, people prearrange their funerals all the time. But here's what's weird. He clicked to another screen showing a different data set. Of those 73 deaths, 49 were elderly individuals living alone. All died at home. All were listed as natural causes: heart failure, stroke, complications from diabetes. But when I cross-referenced with medical records, 21 of them had no prior history of serious cardiac problems. They just died suddenly. Bo felt his blood run cold. 21 suspicious deaths over 2 years. And they'd all been processed by the same funeral home, signed off on by the same coroner, buried without anyone asking questions. How did we miss this? Because they were elderly, Blanchard said quietly. Because people die of natural causes all the time, and nobody thinks to question it when someone in their 80s has a heart attack. Especially not when there's a respected funeral director handling everything properly. Except it wasn't proper, Bo muttered. It was murder made to look natural. His phone rang. The number showed as the hospital. Bo answered. Sheriff Habert. Bo, it's Eulalie. I ran a preliminary test on Margaret Trosclaire's blood. I found 3 different sedatives: diazepam, midazolam, and something I couldn't immediately identify. The levels were low enough that they wouldn't kill someone directly, but combined with her age and any existing health conditions, they'd be enough to cause cardiac arrest. Can you prove she didn't take them voluntarily? The injection marks prove someone administered them, and the combination of drugs, it's not something a doctor would prescribe together. This was deliberate, calculated to cause a fatal cardiac event while looking like natural death. Bo looked at the spreadsheet on Blanchard's screen, thinking about 21 people who'd died the same way. How long would it take for the drugs to work? Depends on the dosage and the person's metabolism, but probably between 12 and 24 hours. Whoever administered them would be long gone by the time the victim died. That fit the pattern. Clem visiting elderly residents under the guise of funeral prearrangements, injecting them with a lethal combination of drugs, then leaving. By the time they died, he'd be at the funeral home, waiting for the call to pick up another body. It was methodical, professional, and it had been going on for years. Get me a full toxicology report as soon as you can, Bo said. I'm going to need it to get a warrant. After he hung up, Bo sat down at his desk and started typing up a warrant application. But even as he worked, he knew it wasn't going to be easy. Clem Doucet was a pillar of the community, a businessman with 30 years of unblemished service. Accusing him of being a serial killer who preyed on the elderly would require ironclad evidence. And right now, all they had was circumstantial, suspicious deaths, drug traces, and a pattern that could still be explained away as coincidence. Bo was still working on the warrant when Deputy Blanchard knocked on his doorframe. Sheriff, we've got a problem. What now? I just got a call from the hospital. Someone tried to access the refrigerated unit where we're storing Margaret Trosclaire's body. Security stopped them, but they got away before anyone could get a good look. Bo stood up, grabbing his jacket. Did they get inside? No, the lock's held. But Sheriff, whoever it was, knew exactly where the unit was parked. They went straight to it. Bo's jaw tightened, the dark sedan, the feeling of being watched. Someone was trying to cover their tracks. Double the security on that unit. I want eyes on it 24/7, and put out an alert. Anyone seen near the hospital acting suspicious, I want them detained for questioning. Yes, sir. Bo drove back to the hospital, his mind racing through possibilities. If Clem knew they were on to him, he'd be taking steps to protect himself. Destroying evidence, eliminating witnesses, maybe even preparing to run. They needed to move fast before he could do any more damage. The hospital parking lot was lit up like daytime, extra security lights installed since the storm. The refrigerated unit sat near the emergency entrance, with 2 security guards posted beside it. They snapped to attention when Bo approached. "Anyone come by since the attempted break-in?" Bo asked. "No, sir," one of the guards said. "Been quiet." Bo inspected the unit's locks. They showed scratch marks. Someone had tried to pick them. Professional work, not the fumbling attempts of an amateur. Whoever had been here knew what they were doing. He was about to head inside when his radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is Unit 3. We've got that dark sedan. Spotted it parked near Doucet Funeral Home. No plates visible, engine running." Bo's pulse quickened. "Don't approach. Maintain surveillance and wait for backup. I'm en route." He drove fast through the empty streets, lights flashing but no siren. The funeral home was only a few minutes away, and as he approached, he could see the dark sedan parked in the shadows beside the building. Unit 3 was positioned across the street, watching. Bo pulled up behind it and climbed out, hand resting on his sidearm. The sedan's engine was running, exhaust visible in the humid night air. The driver's door was open, but no one was inside. Bo approached carefully, flashlight sweeping the interior. Empty. But on the passenger seat was a leather bag, partially unzipped. Inside, Bo could see medical supplies, syringes, vials of clear liquid, rubber tubing. "Sheriff," the deputy in Unit 3 called softly. "Movement at the funeral home, side entrance." Bo looked up and saw a figure emerging from the building, carrying what looked like a cardboard box. In the darkness, he couldn't make out details, but the person moved with purpose, heading straight for the sedan. Bo stepped around the car, positioning himself in the person's path. "Stop right there, Sheriff's Department." The figure froze. In his flashlight beam, Bo saw Clem Doucet's pale face, eyes wide with surprise. The box in his arms was labeled with the parish seal. Official documents. "Sheriff," Clem said, his voice carefully neutral. "Is there a problem?" "Step away from the vehicle and put the box down." Slowly. Clem complied, setting the box on the ground. "I was just doing some late-night filing. The storm created a lot of paperwork backlog." "At 10 o'clock at night, with your car running and ready to go?" "I was about to head home." Bo gestured to the deputy. "Secure him." Then he looked in the box. It was full of documents, death certificates, medical records, intake forms, all related to elderly residents who'd died in the last 2 years. And on top of the pile, Bo saw his own welfare check reports, the ones he'd filed for the 5 bodies he'd found after the storm. "Mr. Doucet," Bo said quietly, "you're under arrest for suspicion of murder. You have the right to remain silent." As he read Clem his rights, the undertaker's expression remained calm, almost serene. But his eyes, those dark, deep-set eyes, held something that made Bo's skin crawl. Not fear or guilt, but calculation, like he was already working through his next move. They transported Clem to the station and placed him in an interview room. Bo watched through the one-way glass as Clem sat perfectly still, hands folded on the table, staring at nothing. The man didn't fidget, didn't show any signs of stress, just sat there like he was waiting for an appointment. "He's not normal," Deputy Blanchard muttered, standing beside Bo. "No," Bo agreed, "he's not." Eulalie arrived at midnight with the full toxicology report. The drugs in Margaret Trosclair's system were exactly what she'd suspected, a combination designed to cause cardiac arrest while leaving minimal traces. The injection sites confirmed the drugs had been administered by someone with medical knowledge. It was enough for a warrant, enough to search the funeral home, enough to start building a case. But as Bo prepared to enter the interview room, his phone rang. Unknown number. "Sheriff Hebert." Silence, then faintly a voice, elderly, confused. "Hello? Is someone there?" "This is Sheriff Hebert. Who am I speaking to?" I don't know where I am. It's dark. I can hear water. Beau's blood ran cold. What's your name? Boudreaux. Emile Boudreaux. I think I'm in trouble. But Emile Boudreaux was dead. Beau had found his body himself 3 days ago, had watched Clem loaded into the funeral home van. Mr. Boudreaux, where are you right now? There are others here, in the dark. They're not moving. I think the line went dead. Beau stared at his phone, his mind reeling. It had to be a prank, some sick joke, but the voice had sounded genuine. Scared, confused, desperate. And if there was even the slightest chance that Emile Boudreaux was alive, that somehow he'd survived what Beau had assumed was death, then they needed to search the funeral home immediately. Get me that warrant, Beau said to Blanchard. Now, and assemble a search team. We're going to Doucet's funeral home, and we're going to tear it apart until we find out what the hell is going on. Through the one-way glass, Clem Doucet finally moved. He turned his head slowly toward the window, and though Beau knew the man couldn't see through it, it felt like their eyes met. And Clem smiled. The warrant came through at 1:30 in the morning. Judge Melanson had been reluctant to sign it. Clem Doucet was a respected member of the community after all, and the evidence was largely circumstantial. But the toxicology report on Margaret Trosclair, combined with the documents Clem had been trying to remove from the funeral home, had been enough to convince him. By 2 a.m., Beau had assembled a team of 6 deputies and was heading toward Doucet Funeral Home with search authorization in hand. The building looked different at night. What had seemed graceful and dignified in daylight now appeared cold and institutional, its white columns casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The windows were dark except for a single light in what Beau knew was the embalming room, a fact that made his stomach tighten. Clem had been alone in the building when they'd arrested him, so who had left that light on? Blanchard, take 2 deputies and cover the back entrance, Beau said quietly. Nobody comes in or out without my say-so. The rest of you, with me. We go through the front, room by room. If you find anything, and I mean anything, that looks suspicious, you document it before you touch it. Cameras ready. The deputies nodded, checking their equipment. They had body cameras, evidence bags, fingerprint kits, and enough flashlights to illuminate every corner of the building. This search was going to be thorough and documented because Beau knew that anything they found would be scrutinized in court. If Clem Doucet was the serial killer Beau suspected, then every piece of evidence had to be bulletproof. They approached the front entrance, and Beau used the keys they'd taken from Clem during his arrest. The lock clicked open, and the heavy wooden door swung inward with barely a sound. Inside, the funeral home was exactly as Beau remembered from the few times he'd been here for services. Tasteful furniture, soft lighting, the faint smell of flowers and something chemical underneath. Everything was designed to be soothing, to put grieving families at ease. But knowing what he knew now, it all felt like a facade. All right, Beau said, his voice low. Let's split up. Ramirez and Guidry, you take the viewing rooms and chapel. Hibbert and I will check the office and preparation areas. Remember, document everything. They moved through the building methodically, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The viewing rooms were empty, chairs arranged in neat rows facing closed caskets on display. The chapel was similarly vacant, hymnals stacked in the pews, a cross mounted on the wall. Everything looked normal, too normal. Beau made his way toward the administrative offices, pushing open a door marked Private. Inside was a neat, organized workspace. Desk with a computer, filing cabinets along one wall, a bookshelf filled with industry manuals and what looked like medical texts. He sat down at the desk and started going through drawers, finding the usual business documents, invoices, receipts, correspondence with casket suppliers and cemetery managers. Nothing immediately incriminating. But when he booted up the computer, something caught his attention. The system required a password, but it was already logged in. Clem must have been working when they'd arrested him. Bo scanned through the open files and found a spreadsheet that made his blood run cold. It was a list. Names, dates, addresses, and beside each name was a notation, consultation, followed by a date and time. Then, days or weeks later, another notation, service completed. Bo scrolled through the list, recognizing some of the names from the welfare checks he'd conducted. Margaret Trosclair, Emile Boudreau, and dozens more, going back years. But it was the column on the far right that made Bo's hands shake. It was labeled Status and contained just two options, complete or pending. Most entries were marked complete, but seven names were marked pending, and all 7 had consultation dates within the last week. Bo pulled out his radio. "All units, I need current addresses for 7 individuals." He read off the names from the screen. "Wellness checks on all of them right now. I don't care what time it is, wake them up if you have to, but I need confirmation that they're alive." "Copy that, Sheriff," came the response. Bo kept searching the computer, opening files and folders. He found medical records, detailed notes on each person's health conditions, medications, vulnerabilities. He found supply orders, large quantities of sedatives and paralytic agents, far more than a funeral home would need for standard embalming. And he found photographs. The photos were clinical, almost scientific. They showed elderly individuals in various states, some sleeping peacefully in their beds, others sitting in chairs, a few lying on what looked like examination tables. In each photo, their arms were visible, showing injection sites marked with pen circles. It was documentation, evidence of what Clem had done to each victim before they died. But why would he document it? What possible reason could he have? Bo's radio crackled. "Sheriff, this is Ramirez. You need to see what we found in the basement." Bo felt his stomach drop. "On my way." He made his way through the building, following signs that pointed toward preparation rooms and storage. A staircase descended into darkness, and Bo clicked on his flashlight as he headed down. The air grew cooler as he descended, and that chemical smell, formaldehyde and something else, something wrong, grew stronger. The basement was divided into several rooms. The first was the embalming room he'd expected. Stainless steel tables, drainage systems, cabinets full of chemicals and tools. Everything was clean and organized, exactly what you'd find in any funeral home. But Deputy Ramirez was standing near a door at the back of the room, his face pale. "In there," he said, pointing. Bo approached the door. It was heavy, reinforced, with a keypad lock that had been left open. He pushed it inward, and his flashlight beam revealed a room that made his breath catch. It was a cold storage unit, larger than he'd expected, with temperature controls and humidity gauges on the wall. But instead of the neat rows of bodies on gurneys he'd anticipated, he saw something else. Along the far wall were what looked like hospital beds. 6 of them, arranged in 2 rows, and in 5 of those beds were people, elderly people, not moving, not breathing visibly, connected to IV lines that ran to bags hanging above each bed. Their skin had that waxy, gray pallor that Bo associated with death, but something about the scene was wrong. The IV bags were still dripping. The heart monitors beside each bed showed faint, slow readings. These people weren't dead. They were in some kind of suspended state, kept alive but barely, hovering in that space between life and death. "Jesus Christ," Bo whispered. He moved closer, checking each bed. The first person he recognized was Emile Boudreau, the man who'd supposedly died 3 days ago. the man whose body he'd personally confirmed as deceased. But Emil's chest was moving, shallow breaths so slow they were almost imperceptible. His eyes were closed, his body motionless except for that faint respiratory movement. The phone call. It hadn't been a hoax. Somehow, impossibly, Emil had been conscious enough to call for help. Beau checked the other beds. He recognized 2 more faces from recent welfare checks. People he'd found in their homes, people he'd certified as dead, people whose bodies had been picked up by Clem Doucet's funeral home. But they weren't dead. They were here, kept in this horrifying liminal state, neither alive nor gone. "Get ambulances here now," Beau said into his radio, his voice tight. "Multiple victims, critical condition, and get me a medical team. We're going to need doctors who know how to reverse sedation." He looked at the IV bags more closely. They were labeled with the medical terminology he didn't fully understand, but he could make out enough. Propofol, midazolam, neuromuscular blocking agents. Drugs that paralyzed the body, that slowed all vital signs to near-death levels. Drugs that would make someone appear dead to a cursory examination but could be reversed with proper medical intervention. That's what Clem had been doing. He hadn't been killing these people outright. He'd been putting them in a death-like state, convincing their families they'd died naturally, then keeping them here in his basement, suspended in this nightmare between worlds. But why? What was the purpose of keeping them alive but incapacitated? Beau noticed something else. A camera mounted in the corner of the room, its red recording light still active. He looked around and spotted more cameras, covering every angle. This was being documented, recorded, preserved. "Sheriff," Deputy Ramirez called from the doorway. "There's another room. You need to see it." Beau forced himself to leave the cold storage unit, though every instinct screamed at him to stay with the victims, to make sure they were safe. He followed Ramirez through another door, this one leading to what appeared to be an office of sorts. But instead of desks and filing cabinets, the walls were covered with photographs. Hundreds of them, arranged in chronological order. They showed the same thing the computer files had shown: elderly individuals in various states of sedation and paralysis. But these photographs went back further, decades, judging by the fading and the clothing styles. And beside each photograph was a handwritten note, detailing the drug combinations used, the time from administration to apparent death, the success or failure of the procedure. This wasn't just murder. This was experimentation. Clem Doucet had been refining his technique over years, testing different combinations of drugs, documenting the results, perfecting the art of making people appear dead without actually killing them. And the earlier photographs showed failures, people who had actually died from the drugs, their deaths marked with red X's and notes about dosage adjustments. Beau felt sick. This was systematic, scientific, the work of someone who viewed human beings as test subjects, who had no regard for the suffering he caused. And it had been going on for decades, right here in the heart of the parish, without anyone noticing or questioning. "How many?" Ramirez asked quietly, looking at the wall of photographs. Beau couldn't bring himself to count. "Too many." His radio crackled with updates from the deputies conducting wellness checks. Of the 7 names marked pending on Clem's list, 4 were found safe in their homes, confused but unharmed. 2 didn't answer their doors, and 1, an elderly man named Thibault who lived alone near the levee, was found unconscious in his bed with fresh injection marks on his arms. An ambulance was already en route. Beau's jaw tightened. They'd gotten to Thibault in time, but how many others hadn't been so lucky? How many people had died in this basement, their deaths attributed to natural causes, while Clem Doucet experimented on them like they were nothing more than laboratory animals? Footsteps on the stairs made everyone turn. Eulalie appeared, carrying a medical kit, her face determined despite the late hour. "I came as soon as I heard. Where are they?" Bo led her to the cold storage unit. Her reaction was immediate and visceral. She gasped, one hand going to her mouth, but then her professional training kicked in. She moved to the nearest bed, checking vitals, examining the IV lines, her movements quick and efficient. "These drugs, this combination, it's designed to mimic death," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "Slowed heart rate, minimal respiration, reduced brain activity. To someone without proper medical equipment, they'd appear deceased, but with the right intervention, it's reversible." "How long do we have?" Bo asked. "Depends on how long they've been under. The longer they're in this state, the more likely there will be permanent damage. Organ failure, brain damage, system shutdown. But if we move fast, we might be able to save them." She looked at Bo, her eyes fierce. "We need to get them to the hospital immediately, all of them. And we need specialists, anesthesiologists, toxicologists, people who know how to reverse these specific drugs." The next hour was chaos. Ambulances arrived, their lights painting the funeral home in alternating red and white. Medical teams worked to stabilize the 5 victims in the basement, carefully disconnecting them from Clem's IV systems and replacing them with proper emergency medical equipment. News spread quickly. By dawn, there were reporters gathering outside, camera crews setting up. The story already going national. Bo coordinated everything from the funeral home's front steps, his phone constantly ringing with calls from state police, the FBI, the parish council. Everyone wanted answers, and he had precious few to give. All he knew for certain was that Clem Doucet had been operating a house of horrors disguised as a respectable business, and they were only beginning to understand the full scope of his crimes. By the time the last ambulance pulled away, carrying Émile Boudreau to the hospital, the sun was starting to rise. Bo stood in the funeral home's parking lot, exhausted and shaken, watching the sky turn from black to deep purple to pale orange. Deputy Blanchard approached, carrying a box of evidence bags. "We found more," Blanchard said quietly. "In a hidden compartment under the office floor. Financial records showing payments from families for extended care of their deceased loved ones. Clem was charging them to keep their relatives in storage, telling them it was some kind of special preservation process while they arranged services. Some of these payments go back years." Bo closed his eyes. It was worse than he'd thought. Not just experimentation, but exploitation. Clem had been taking money from grieving families, promising to care for their loved ones while actually keeping them in that horrible, suspended state in his basement. How much money are we talking about? Hundreds of thousands, maybe more. He had offshore accounts, properties in other states. This was organized, Sheriff, planned. He's been building this operation for decades. The door to the funeral home opened, and 2 evidence technicians emerged carrying a laptop. "Sheriff, you need to see what's on this." They set the laptop on the hood of Bo's cruiser and opened a video file. The screen showed the cold storage room from one of the mounted cameras. The timestamp was from 6 months ago. In the video, Clem Doucet entered the frame, wearing surgical scrubs, carrying a clipboard. He moved from bed to bed, checking monitors, adjusting IV drips, making notes. His movements were calm, methodical, professional. But then the video showed something that made Bo's blood run cold. One of the patients, an elderly woman Bo didn't recognize, began to move. Just slightly. Just a twitch of her hand, a flutter of her eyelids. She was waking up, fighting through the drugs, and Clem noticed. He set down his clipboard and picked up a syringe from a nearby tray. He didn't hesitate, didn't show any emotion. He simply injected the woman with whatever was in that syringe, and within seconds she stopped moving, went still. Her monitor showed her heart rate dropping dropping until it flatlined. Clem checked his watch, made a note on his clipboard, then calmly disconnected the woman's IV and wheeled her bed out of frame. When he returned minutes later, the bed was empty. He began preparing it for the next patient. "There are dozens of videos like this," the technician said quietly. "Patients waking up, Clem administering lethal injections. He kept records of everything." Bo turned away, unable to watch anymore. This was beyond anything he'd dealt with in his career. This wasn't just murder, it was systematic torture. A complete disregard for human life, carried out by someone who'd hidden behind a mask of respectability for decades. His phone rang. The hospital. "Sheriff, this is Dr. Benoit. I'm overseeing the care of the patients brought in from the funeral home. I wanted to update you on their conditions." "Go ahead." 3 of the 5 are responding to treatment. We're slowly bringing them out of sedation, and their vital signs are stabilizing. Emile Boudreau is conscious and talking, confused and traumatized, but alive. The other 2, the doctor paused. "They've been under too long. We're seeing signs of organ failure, brain damage. We're doing everything we can, but I'm not optimistic." Bo felt the weight of those words. 2 people who might not survive because of Clem Doucet's experiments. 2 more victims to add to what was already a staggering death toll. "What about the man we found this morning, Thibault? He's going to make it. You got to him early enough that the drugs hadn't fully taken effect. He was lucky." Lucky. Bo almost laughed at the word. There was nothing lucky about being targeted by a serial killer, about being injected with paralytics and left to die. But compared to the others, to the ones who'd spent days or weeks in that basement suspended between life and death, maybe Thibault was lucky. "Thank you, doctor. Keep me updated." Bo hung up and looked at the funeral home. Crime scene tape now surrounded the building, and evidence technicians continued to carry out boxes of documents and equipment. This place would never operate again. Its license would be revoked, the building likely condemned. But that felt like small justice compared to what had happened here. Deputy Blanchard approached again, his expression grim. "Sheriff, we need to decide what to do about Doucet. He's been in the interview room all night, and his lawyer just arrived. They're demanding he be released on bail." "Not a chance," Bo said. "File charges for multiple counts of murder, attempted murder, kidnapping, fraud. Throw everything at him, and get the prosecutor on the phone. I want to make sure this case is airtight before we bring it to trial." Back at the station, Bo finally allowed himself to sit down in his office. His body ached from exhaustion, and his mind kept replaying images from the basement. Those elderly faces, pale and still, trapped in Clem's horrific experiment. He thought about all the families who'd grieved for loved ones they thought were dead, who'd held funerals and buried empty caskets while Clem kept their relatives alive in that nightmare storage unit. There would be lawsuits, investigations, federal charges. This was going to dominate the parish for years, maybe decades. The Doucet funeral home case would become infamous, studied by criminologists and psychologists trying to understand how one man could commit such systematic evil. But right now, Bo just wanted to know why. What had driven Clem Doucet to do this? What possible motivation could explain decades of torture and murder? The door opened and Eulalie stepped in. She looked as exhausted as Bo felt, her scrubs stained and her hair falling loose from its bun, but her eyes were bright with anger. "Emile Boudreau is talking," she said. "He remembers some of what happened to him. I thought you'd want to hear it." Bo stood immediately. "Let's go." At the hospital, they were led to a private room where Emile lay in bed, connected to monitors but conscious and alert. His face was still pale, and his hands shook when he tried to lift them, but his eyes were clear. "Sheriff," he said, his voice hoarse, "I remember you. You found me." "Yes, sir," Bo said gently. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been dead for 3 days." Emil attempted a weak smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Nurse St. Cyr says that's not far from the truth." Bo pulled a chair close to the bed. "Mr. Boudreau, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions about what happened. Can you tell me the last thing you remember before you ended up at the funeral home?" Emil's eyes grew distant. "Clem Doucet came to my house, said he wanted to discuss prearranging my funeral now that my wife was gone. I thought it was thoughtful, you know? Planning ahead, making things easier for my kids. He brought papers for me to sign, coffee to drink while we talked." His hands trembled. The coffee tasted bitter. I mentioned it, and he just smiled. Said the storm had affected the water quality. "What happened after you drank it?" I started feeling strange, dizzy, weak. I tried to get up, but my legs wouldn't work. And Clem, he just sat there watching me, waiting. When I fell back in my chair, he pulled out a syringe. I tried to tell him no, tried to push him away, but I couldn't move, couldn't scream. I could only watch as he injected me with something. Emil's voice broke, and Eulalie moved forward to check his monitors. "We can stop if this is too much," she said softly. "No." Emil shook his head. "No, I need to say this. After the injection, everything went dark, like falling into a deep hole. But I wasn't. I wasn't dead. I could still think, still feel, but I couldn't move or see or speak. It was like being buried alive, trapped inside my own body." Bo felt sick. "How long were you in that state?" "I don't know. Time was strange. Sometimes I could hear things, voices, footsteps, machines beeping. I tried so hard to wake up, to move, to make any sound. Once, for just a few seconds, I could open my eyes. I saw other people in beds like mine, saw Clem walking between us with his clipboard, like we were experiments." Tears ran down Emil's weathered face. I managed to grab my phone. Don't know how, just pure will, I think. Called the last number I dialed, which was your office, but then the drugs pulled me back under. "You saved yourself," Bo said quietly. "That phone call led us to you, led us to all the others." "How many?" Emil asked. "How many people did he do this to?" Bo hesitated. "We're still counting, but based on the evidence we've found, dozens, maybe more." Emil closed his eyes. All those funerals I attended over the years, all those friends who died peacefully in their sleep. Were they? We don't know yet, but we're going to investigate every death processed through that funeral home. Everyone who died under suspicious circumstances is going to be reviewed. They talked for a few more minutes before Eulalie insisted Emil needed rest. As Bo was leaving, the old man called out to him. "Sheriff, why? Why did he do it?" Bo had been asking himself the same question all night. "I don't know, Mr. Boudreau, but I promise you, we're going to find out." Back at the station, Bo prepared to interview Clem Doucet. The undertaker had been in the holding cell all night, and according to the deputies, he'd been completely calm the entire time. No pacing, no demands, just sitting quietly, like he was waiting patiently for something. Bo entered the interview room where Clem now sat with his lawyer, a slick-looking man from Baton Rouge named Cormier. Clem looked up as Bo entered, and that small smile appeared on his face again. "Sheriff Haber," Clem said pleasantly, as if they were meeting for coffee. "I understand you've been busy tonight." Bo set a folder on the table and sat down. "Mr. Doucet, you're being charged with 12 counts of murder, 7 counts of attempted murder, and numerous other felonies. Before we begin this interview, I want to make sure you understand your rights. My client has already been advised of his rights, the lawyer interjected, and he has nothing to say without immunity. Bo ignored him, keeping his eyes on Clem. Why did you do it? Why did you torture those people? Clem tilted his head, considering. Torture is such a harsh word, Sheriff. I prefer to think of it as preservation, extending the boundary between life and death, creating a space where people could exist without the burden of consciousness, without pain or fear or suffering. You kept them prisoners. You paralyzed them and trapped them in their own bodies. I kept them alive, Clem corrected gently. Their families thought they were dead, grieved for them, moved on, but I preserved them, maintained them. They were safe in my care. Safe? Bo's voice rose, despite his best efforts to stay calm. You injected them with drugs that mimicked death. You kept them in a basement, connected to machines. How is that safe? Clem's smile widened slightly. Because dead is final, Sheriff. What I did gave them another chance. A state of suspension where they could wait, where they could be kept until medical science advanced enough to truly revive them, to restore them to full health. Bo stared at him, realizing with horror that Clem actually believed what he was saying. This wasn't just cruelty for cruelty's sake. This was a twisted philosophy, a warped belief that what he was doing was somehow merciful. You killed people, Bo said flatly. The videos show you injecting patients with lethal doses when they started to wake up. Only the failures, Clem said, his tone matter-of-fact. The ones whose bodies rejected the process, who couldn't achieve stable suspension. It would have been cruel to let them wake up in that state, confused, damaged, suffering. A quick death was kinder. Kinder? Bo wanted to reach across the table and shake him. You don't get to decide who lives and dies. You don't get to experiment on people like they're lab rats. Someone has to push the boundaries of what's possible, Clem said calmly. Someone has to be willing to do the difficult work. And I was uniquely positioned. Access to the dying, the trust of families, the privacy to conduct my research. It was almost a calling. His lawyer put a hand on his arm. Clem, stop talking. But Clem ignored him, his eyes fixed on Bo. You found them in time, didn't you? The 5 in storage. Are they awake? Bo didn't answer. I hope they are, Clem continued, because they'll understand eventually. They'll realize I was trying to help them, to give them more time. And someday, when medical science catches up to what I started, they'll thank me for preserving them instead of letting them die. The lawyer stood abruptly. This interview is over. My client won't be saying anything else. As they led Clem back to his cell, he turned and looked at Bo one last time. The bodies in the cemetery, he said. The ones we buried over the years. You might want to check on them, Sheriff. Not all of them were actually dead when we put them in the ground. Bo felt the room spin. What? But Clem was already being led away, that small smile still on his face, leaving Bo with a new nightmare to contemplate. How many people had been buried alive, placed in coffins while they were still in that suspended state, sealed into the earth to suffocate or starve in darkness? The investigation exploded after that. Every burial conducted by Duce Funeral Home over the last 20 years was reviewed. Exhumations were ordered for suspicious cases, and the parish cemetery became another crime scene, backhoes digging up graves while forensic teams examined remains for signs of premature burial. They found evidence of at least 8 people who had been buried while still in that death-like state. The condition of the coffins, scratches on the inside, torn fabric, told the story of their final, desperate hours. Trapped underground, paralyzed but conscious, dying slowly in the dark. The parish would never be the same. Trust was shattered. Every death, every funeral, every burial was now viewed with suspicion. And the Doucet Funeral Home, that elegant building with its white columns and manicured grounds, stood empty and condemned, a monument to the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Beau stood outside the building one last time before it was scheduled for demolition. The sun was setting, painting the structure in shades of orange and red. He thought about all the people who had suffered here, all the families who had been deceived, all the lives that had been destroyed by one man's twisted philosophy. His phone buzzed. A text from Eulalie. "Emile and the others are being released from the hospital tomorrow. They're going to make it." Some of them, at least. Some had survived. That would have to be enough. As Beau turned to leave, he heard it again, that bell, faint and distant, carried on the evening breeze. He looked toward St. Michael's Church, but the building was too far away to see clearly. The bell rang again, steady and measured, and Beau knew it was just the wind and broken machinery, the same natural explanation as before. But it sounded like a warning. The trial of Clem Doucet began 6 months after his arrest, and it drew media attention from across the country. Reporters packed the parish courthouse, their cameras and microphones turning what should have been a somber proceeding into a spectacle. Beau sat in the gallery every day, watching as the prosecution built their case piece by piece. Toxicology reports, video evidence, testimony from survivors. It was overwhelming, irrefutable. And yet Clem sat at the defense table with that same calm expression, occasionally taking notes, never showing any sign of remorse or fear. The defense's strategy was predictable but disturbing. They didn't deny what Clem had done. The evidence made that impossible. Instead, they argued diminished capacity, claiming that Clem suffered from a delusional disorder that made him genuinely believe he was helping his victims. Psychiatric experts testified about his detachment from reality, his inability to comprehend the suffering he'd caused. They painted him as mentally ill rather than evil, someone who needed treatment rather than punishment. Beau listened to it all with mounting frustration. He'd seen the meticulous planning in Clem's records, the calculated way he'd selected victims, the careful documentation of his experiments. This wasn't the work of someone divorced from reality. This was someone who knew exactly what he was doing and had chosen to do it anyway. The prosecution called Emile Boudreau to testify on the 4th day of the trial. The old man had recovered physically, though the psychological scars were evident in the way his hands shook as he took the oath, the way his voice wavered when he described waking up paralyzed, trapped in his own body. The courtroom fell silent as he spoke, and Beau saw several jurors wiping their eyes. "Can you describe what it felt like, Mr. Boudreau?" the prosecutor asked gently. "Being conscious but unable to move or communicate." Emile's voice was barely above a whisper. "Like drowning, like being buried alive. I could hear everything around me. Machines beeping, footsteps, other people crying out, but I couldn't respond. Couldn't tell anyone I was still there, still aware." He looked directly at Clem. He knew. When I managed to move my hand that one time when I grabbed my phone, he saw it. And instead of helping me, instead of calling for medical attention, he just increased my dosage. Put me back under. Because I was inconvenient. Because I wasn't following his protocol. The defense attorney tried to shake his testimony during cross-examination, suggesting that Emile's memories might be confused, distorted by the drugs. But Emile held firm. "I know what happened to me," he said. "I know what he did, and I know he enjoyed it." That last statement drew an objection, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the look in Emile's eyes, had heard the certainty in his voice. Whatever sympathy they might have had for Clem's supposed mental illness was evaporating. Eulalie testified next. walking the jury through the toxicology findings, explaining how the drug combinations were designed to mimic death while keeping the victims technically alive. She was clinical in her presentation, but her contempt for what had been done was clear in every word. This wasn't medical experimentation in pursuit of advancing science, she said, when the defense attorney suggested that Clem had been trying to push the boundaries of medical knowledge. This was torture. These drugs cause extreme distress, panic, suffocation, pain, even when the victim can't express it. Mr. Ducey knew this. His records show he understood the suffering he was causing, and he did it anyway. The trial lasted 3 weeks. By the end, the defense's argument had crumbled under the weight of evidence. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. 12 counts of first-degree murder for the victims who died during his experiments, 7 counts of attempted murder for those who'd survived, and dozens of additional charges ranging from kidnapping to fraud. The judge sentenced Clem to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs led him away, he turned and looked at Beau one last time, and smiled. That smile haunted Beau for weeks afterward. He'd put away killers before, had seen plenty of criminals show no remorse for their actions. But there was something different about Clem, a complete absence of humanity, as if he were looking at the world through glass, observing but never truly participating. Beau wondered if that was what made him so dangerous, not rage or greed or even madness, but a fundamental disconnection from the empathy that made people human. The aftermath of the trial dragged on for months. Civil lawsuits were filed by the families of victims, seeking damages from Clem's estate and from the parish oversight boards that had failed to catch his crimes. The funeral home building was demolished, the land sold to developers who promised to build something that would serve the community rather than prey on it. The parish cemetery remained under investigation as more exhumations were ordered, each one potentially revealing another victim who'd been buried alive. Beau threw himself into the work, coordinating with state and federal investigators, overseeing the ongoing examination of Clem's records, following up on every lead that might identify additional victims. It was exhausting, consuming, and necessary, because every day they worked was another day they might find someone who'd been wronged, another family who deserved answers. But the work took its toll. Beau found himself having trouble sleeping, lying awake at night thinking about those 5 people in Clem's basement, suspended between life and death. He thought about the 8 who'd been buried alive, their final moments of consciousness spent in suffocating darkness. And he thought about all the others, the ones they hadn't found yet, the ones whose deaths had been accepted as natural when they'd been anything but. 3 months after the trial ended, Beau was in his office reviewing yet another stack of death certificates when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. He'd been getting calls from reporters and true crime enthusiasts ever since the case went national, but something made him pick up. Sheriff Hebert? Silence. Then, faintly, a voice he recognized. Sheriff, it's Dr. Benoit from the hospital. I'm calling about one of the survivors from the Ducey case, Marcel Portier. He's been readmitted with complications. Beau felt his stomach tighten. Marcel had been one of the 5 found in Clem's basement, one of the 3 who'd recovered enough to return home. What kind of complications? Neurological. He's been experiencing seizures, memory loss, progressive cognitive decline. We think it's related to the prolonged sedation. The drugs may have caused permanent damage that's only now manifesting. Dr. Benoit paused. Sheriff, I've examined the other survivors. They're showing similar symptoms. Early stage, but consistent. I think what Clem did to them is continuing to cause harm, even now. Beau closed his eyes. How bad is it going to get? I don't know. There's no precedent for this kind of sustained chemical paralysis. We're in uncharted territory, but the prognosis isn't good. They may have survived the immediate trauma, but the long-term effects..." The doctor didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. After he hung up, Beau sat alone in his office, staring at the wall. Even from prison, Clem Doucet was still killing people. The damage he'd done was irreversible, progressive. A slow poison that would claim his victims eventually, even though they'd been rescued. It was a final cruelty, an extension of his power beyond the courtroom and the prison walls. Beau drove to the hospital that evening to visit Marcel. The man who greeted him was a shadow of the person who'd testified at trial. Marcel's eyes were vacant, his movements uncoordinated, his speech slurred and halting. He didn't recognize Beau at first, and when he finally did, the memory seemed to cause him pain. "Sheriff," he said slowly, "they tell me I'm dying, slow, because of what he did." "We're going to do everything we can," Beau said, though the words felt hollow. Marcel shook his head weakly. No stopping it. Brain damage, getting worse." He grabbed Beau's hand with surprising strength. "Find them. Others. Must be others. He did this. Too long, too many. We're still investigating. Every death he processed, every person who had contact with his funeral home, we won't stop until..." "Cemetery," Marcel interrupted. "Check. Cemetery again. Not all the bodies." Beau felt a chill run down his spine. "What do you mean?" "He told me. When I was in the basement. He talked to us, thought we couldn't hear. Said some coffins, empty, sold the bodies, research, medical schools, black market." Marcel's eyes focused with sudden intensity. "Dozens, maybe hundreds, not in graves, never buried, just gone." Beau's mind raced. They'd exhumed dozens of graves looking for evidence of premature burial, but they'd assumed all the coffins contained bodies. If Clem had been removing bodies before burial, replacing them with weights or nothing at all, then the scope of his crimes was even larger than they'd imagined. Did he say where the bodies went? Marcel's grip loosened, his moment of clarity fading. "Research. Always research. Never waste a specimen." That's what he called us. Specimens. Beau stayed with Marcel until the man fell asleep, then immediately called an emergency meeting with the state investigators. By morning, they had authorization to begin systematic exhumations of every burial Clem had conducted over the last 20 years. It was an enormous undertaking, hundreds of graves, thousands of hours of work, astronomical costs, but they had to know the truth. The exhumations began 2 weeks later. Beau was there for the first one, watching as the backhoe carefully removed dirt from a grave that was supposed to contain the body of an elderly woman named Gautreau, who'd died 5 years ago. When they finally opened the coffin, Beau's worst fears were confirmed. It was empty, except for bags of sand used to provide the appropriate weight. The family, who'd been notified and were present, collapsed in grief. Not because their loved one was dead, they'd already mourned that loss, but because they'd never had the chance to properly bury her. Her body had been taken, used for purposes they couldn't imagine, disposed of in ways they'd never know. It was a violation that went beyond death, beyond dignity. It was erasure. Over the next month, they exhumed 47 graves. 32 were found to contain sandbags instead of bodies. 15 contained bodies, but forensic examination revealed evidence of organ harvesting, surgical incisions, missing tissue samples, signs of post-mortem experimentation. The bodies had been used for something before finally being buried. Their remains incomplete, their dignity destroyed. Beau returned to the prison where Clem was being held, bringing copies of the exhumation reports. The guards led him to a small interview room where Clem sat waiting, wearing an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed to the table. He looked thinner than he had at trial, paler, but that smile was still there. "Sheriff Hebert," Clem said, pleasantly. "This is unexpected. Come to discuss the weather?" Bo slammed the folder down on the table. 32 empty graves, 15 more with bodies that had been dissected and experimented on. "Where did you send them, Clem? Where did the bodies go?" Clem's smile widened. "You found those. I wondered if you would. Most people don't look close enough. They accept what they're told, trust what they see on the surface. But you're thorough, I respect that. Answer the question." "Medical schools, primarily. Teaching hospitals. Research facilities that asked fewer questions than they should have. The human body is valuable, Sheriff. Even in death, it has worth. Organs for transplant, tissue for grafting, bones for surgical training. I simply connected supply with demand." Bo felt sick. "You sold them. You sold the bodies of people whose families trusted you." "I redistributed them," Clem corrected. "Ensured they served a purpose beyond rotting in the ground. Those people contributed more to medical advancement in death than they ever did in life. I gave them meaning. You desecrated corpses for profit. I utilized resources that would otherwise have been wasted." Clem leaned forward as much as his restraints allowed. "Do you know how much a complete human skeleton is worth on the medical supply market? How much a fresh cadaver brings for surgical practice? I was sitting on a gold mine, Sheriff. All those elderly people dying naturally, their families too grief-stricken to ask questions. Their bodies coming through my funeral home where I could do whatever I wanted." He paused. It would have been stupid not to take advantage. Bo wanted to hit him, wanted to reach across the table and make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused. But he kept his hands flat on the folder, his voice controlled. "We're bringing additional charges. Desecration of human remains, fraud, illegal organ trafficking. You're never getting out of prison, Clem. You're going to die behind these walls." "Probably," Clem agreed. "But my work will outlive me. Those bodies I provided helped train surgeons, advance research, save lives. In a way, I've contributed more to humanity than most people ever will. That's not nothing." "It's everything," Bo said quietly. "You've destroyed everything. Trust, dignity, the belief that when we bury our loved ones, they're at peace. You've taken that away from dozens of families, maybe hundreds. And for what? Money? Some twisted sense of scientific contribution?" "For progress," Clem said simply. "For advancement. Someone has to be willing to do what others won't. To cross the lines that hold society back. I was that someone." Bo stood, gathering the folder. "Marcel Portier is dying. The drugs you used are causing progressive brain damage. He's going to be dead within the year. So are the others you preserved. Your experiments are still killing people." For the first time, something flickered in Clem's expression. Not remorse, but interest. "Delayed neurological degradation? I hadn't anticipated that. What's the mechanism? Cumulative neurotoxicity? Ischemic cascade?" Bo felt his hands clench into fists. "You're asking me about the mechanism? These are people, Clem. Human beings who survived your torture only to die slowly from what you did to them. And you want to know about the mechanism?" "Of course. If the drugs are causing delayed effects, that's important data. It could inform future research, help others avoid similar complications. The knowledge has value." Bo turned and walked to the door, unable to stomach another second in the same room as this man. But before he left, he looked back. "You're not a researcher. You're not advancing anything. You're just a killer who found a way to make it look professional, and that's all you'll ever be." The investigation continued for another year. They identified 17 facilities that had purchased bodies from Clem. Some legitimate research institutions that believed they were acquiring legally obtained cadavers, others shadier operations that hadn't asked questions. Criminal charges were filed where appropriate. Medical licenses were revoked. The scandal spread far beyond Terrebonne Parish, touching institutions across the country. Beau coordinated with federal agents to trace the money trail, discovering offshore accounts containing millions of dollars that Clem had accumulated over decades of selling bodies. The money was seized and set aside for victim compensation, though no amount of money could truly compensate for what the families had lost. The survivors, those who'd been found in Clem's basement, continued to decline. Marcel Portier died 8 months after Beau's visit to the prison, his brain so damaged by the sustained sedation that he'd lost all cognitive function in his final weeks. 2 others followed within the year. Of the 5 who'd been rescued, only Émile Boudreau and 1 other woman, Ida Thibodeau, remained alive, and both showed signs of the same progressive neurological damage. Beau visited Émile regularly at the nursing facility where he now lived. The old man's condition was deteriorating, his memory was failing, his motor control diminishing, but he still had moments of clarity. During one of those moments, he asked Beau a question that had been weighing on him. Do you think he ever felt anything? Any remorse at all? Beau had asked himself the same question many times. No, I don't think he's capable of it. I think when he looks at people, he sees something different than what the rest of us see. Resources, specimens, opportunities, but not humans. Émile nodded slowly. That's what scared me most. When I was in that basement, when he would come down to check on us, I could see it in his eyes. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't angry, he was just empty. Like there was nothing inside him that recognized us as real. You're safe now, Beau said, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. Émile would never be safe from what had been done to him. The damage was permanent, progressive, fatal. Am I? Émile asked softly. Sometimes I wake up and I can't move, can't speak, and for a moment I think I'm back there, in that bed, connected to those machines, and I wonder if I ever really left, or if this is just another layer of the nightmare. Beau had no answer for that. He just sat with the old man in silence, watching the afternoon light fade through the nursing home windows, both of them haunted by memories of what they'd found in that basement. 2 years after Clem's conviction, Beau stood in the rebuilt section of the parish cemetery where they'd erected a memorial. It was a simple granite wall with names engraved, all the confirmed victims of Clem Doucet's crimes. Some of the names were followed by dates of death. Others just had the word missing, acknowledging that their bodies had never been found, that they'd been sold and scattered and lost to anonymous graves or cremation facilities across the country. Families gathered for the dedication ceremony. Some were crying. Others stood in silent rage. All of them had been robbed of something essential: the right to know what happened to their loved ones, the right to lay them to rest with dignity, the right to trust that the people they'd hired to care for the dead had actually done so. The parish council president spoke about healing and moving forward. A minister offered prayers. But Beau knew that healing wasn't really possible. Not from this. The damage Clem had done went too deep, touched too many lives, violated too many fundamental assumptions about how society was supposed to work. After the ceremony, Eulalie found Beau standing alone near the memorial wall. She'd been there that night when they'd found the first bodies, when they'd realized the scope of what they were dealing with. She'd seen it all, and like Beau, she carried the weight of it. How do you move on from something like this? She asked quietly. I don't know, Beau admitted. I don't think you do move on, you just carry it. Add it to all the other things you carry and hope you're strong enough not to break. Are you strong enough? Bo looked at the names on the wall. Dozens of them, each one representing a person who'd died in fear and pain, whose death had been exploited, whose dignity had been stripped away. I have to be. 3 months later, Bo got the call he'd been dreading. Emile Boudreau had passed away peacefully in his sleep, as peacefully as someone could, given the circumstances. The neurological damage had progressed to the point where he no longer recognized anyone, could no longer speak or move without assistance. In a way, his death was a mercy, an end to suffering that should have ended years ago when he'd first been targeted by Clem Doucet. Bo attended the funeral, watching as Emile's family laid him to rest in a grave they could actually trust contained his body. It was a small comfort, but it was something. Proof that not all of Clem's victims had been lost to the void, that some had been reclaimed, remembered, honored properly. As the service concluded and people began to leave, Bo noticed a car parked across the street from the cemetery. A dark sedan with tinted windows, engine running. It looked familiar, like the one he'd seen that night outside Margaret Trosclair's house. The one they'd never been able to trace. Bo walked toward it, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm, but before he could get close, the car pulled away, disappearing around the corner. Probably nothing. Probably just a reporter or a curious onlooker. But Bo couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished, that some part of Clem's operation, some piece they hadn't discovered, was still out there, still active. Back at the station, Bo pulled up the case files one more time, going through the evidence they'd collected, the testimonies they'd recorded, the financial transactions they'd traced. Everything seemed accounted for, and yet he found himself looking at a detail he'd noted months ago but never followed up on. In Clem's offshore accounts, there were regular payments to an entity listed only as Research Collective Louisiana. The payments had stopped after Clem's arrest, but they'd been going on for years. Tens of thousands of dollars transferred every quarter to an account that had never been linked to any legitimate research institution. Bo made some calls, ran some searches, and slowly a picture began to emerge. The Research Collective wasn't a legitimate organization. It was a front, a network of individuals who'd been buying bodies from Clem and selling them to others. People who'd seen the profit potential in what Clem was doing and had wanted to expand it, systematize it, turn it into a proper business. And they were still operating. Even with Clem in prison, even with the funeral home closed, they'd simply found other sources, other funeral homes that asked fewer questions, other bodies to exploit. Bo felt his jaw tighten. The case wasn't over. It had never been over. They'd caught one monster, but the system that had enabled him, that had profited from his crimes, was still intact. He picked up his phone and called the state police. I need to talk to someone about reopening an investigation. It's about the Doucet case, and I think it's bigger than we realized. That night, Bo drove past the empty lot where Doucet Funeral Home had stood. The building was gone, demolished and hauled away, but the land remained vacant. No one wanted to build there. No one wanted to be associated with what had happened. It was cursed ground, soaked in suffering, avoided by everyone who knew its history. As Bo sat there, engine idling, he heard it again. That bell, distant but clear, ringing across the parish in measured tolls. He looked toward St. Michael's Church, its silhouette barely visible in the darkness. The building was still abandoned, still falling apart, but the bell kept ringing. 1 toll, 2, 3. Bo had explained it away before. Loose rope, building settling, wind catching at just the right angle. But now, sitting in the darkness, listening to that steady rhythm, he wondered if maybe the bell was ringing for a reason. Not supernatural necessarily, just A reminder that some things demand to be remembered, that some crimes echo long after the criminals are caught, that the dead don't always rest quietly. The bell tolled once more, then fell silent. Bo put the car in drive and headed home, carrying with him the knowledge that tomorrow he'd be starting the investigation again. Following the money, tracking the network, finding everyone who'd profited from Clem Doucet's crimes and making sure they faced justice too. Because Marcel Portier had been right. There were others. There would always be others. And as long as there were people willing to see the dead as resources rather than humans deserving of dignity, Beau's work would never be finished. The parish would heal eventually. Trust would be rebuilt slowly and painfully. But some scars would never fade. Some questions would never be answered. And every time someone in Terrebonne Parish heard a bell ringing in the distance, they would remember the funeral home, the basement, the empty graves. They would remember what had been done in their community under the guise of respectability and care, and they would wonder who was next.